They found her stealing bread behind the royal kitchens at dawn, a ghost in rags with hollow eyes and dirt-crusted hands. The guards dragged her through the cobblestones while nobles watched from silk-draped windows, laughing at the fallen servant girl who once polished their silver. But when King Alaric Draven emerged from the shadows and saw her face, something shifted in the air. The most feared ruler in the realm didn't see a thief. He saw the girl from the selection hall, the only one who'd looked at him like he was human. And against every law of blood and throne, he made a choice that would shatter kingdoms. If you're watching from the streets of survival or the halls of power, stay until the end to see how one decision rewrites destiny. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. This story is just beginning. The alley reeked of rotting fish and human desperation. Lyra Vance pressed herself against the cold brick wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps that formed small clouds in the freezing air. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since they'd thrown her out of the palace gates with nothing but the threadbare servant's dress on her back and accusations ringing in her ears like funeral bells. Thief, liar, traitor. None of it true. All of it permanent. Her stomach cramped with hunger so sharp it felt like claws ripping through her insides. She'd learned to ignore it mostly, the gnawing emptiness that never really left, just dulled to a constant ache she carried like a second skeleton. But tonight was worse. Tonight she'd gone 2 full days without finding even a scrap of moldy bread in the merchant quarter's refuse bins. The city of Thornhaven showed no mercy to the fallen, especially not to those who'd fallen from the palace itself. Lyra pulled her arms tighter around her knees, trying to preserve what little warmth remained in her body. Her once smooth hands were now cracked and bleeding, nails broken to the quick from scrabbling through trash heaps and fighting off other desperate souls for scraps. Her dark hair, which she'd once kept neatly braided as befitting a royal servant, now hung in matted tangles around a face hollowed by starvation. She'd stopped looking at her reflection in puddles after the first week. The stranger staring back wasn't someone she recognized anymore. "Move along, street rat," a guard's voice cut through the darkness. Lyra didn't need to look up to know he was talking to her. She'd become an expert at reading danger by sound alone. The heavy footfalls of patrols, the sharp whistle that meant they'd spotted someone to chase, the dark laughter of drunk nobles stumbling from taverns looking for easy targets. She rose on unsteady legs and slipped deeper into the maze of alleys that had become her hunting ground. The old Lyra, the girl who'd served tea to duchesses and polished silverware until it gleamed, would never have believed she could become this. A shadow. A ghost. Something less than human in the eyes of everyone who passed her without seeing. But survival had a way of rewriting everything you thought you knew about yourself. The palace loomed in the distance, its white towers piercing the night sky like accusations. Lyra forced herself not to look at it. Looking back only made the hunger worse, not for food, but for the life she'd lost. The small room she'd shared with 2 other servants, the steady meals plain but sufficient, the quiet pride of work well done, the invisible safety of being part of something larger than herself. All of it gone in a single night. "You should have been more careful," the head housekeeper had hissed as the guards dragged Lyra from her quarters. "Did you really think you could steal from Lady Morgana and get away with it?" "I didn't steal anything," Lyra had screamed, but her voice was drowned out by Lady Morgana's theatrical sobbing, her delicate hand pressed to her forehead as she swayed dramatically before a crowd of concerned nobles. "My mother's necklace, the only thing I had left of her. How could you? I trusted you." It was a masterwork of performance. Even now, Lyra had to admire the skill of it, the way Lady Morgana had played every note perfectly. The trembling voice, the genuine-seeming tears, the wounded innocence that made everyone in the room instantly believe that the noble lady was the victim and the servant was the villain. The necklace had been found in Lyra's trunk, of course, planted there sometime between dinner service and dawn. By the time the sun rose, Lyra's fate was sealed. The palace steward didn't even bother with a trial. Servants didn't get trials. They got judgment, swift and final. "You're fortunate Lady Morgana isn't pressing criminal charges," he'd said, his voice cold as winter iron. "The king has enough concerns without adding thieving servants to his troubles. Get out. If you're seen within 100 yards of the palace again, you'll hang." That was 3 weeks ago. It felt like 3 lifetimes. Lyra emerged from the alley into a broader street, staying close to the buildings where the shadows were deepest. She'd learned the rhythms of the city. When the patrols changed shifts, which merchant stalls threw out yesterday's bread at dusk, where the rats gathered in such numbers that even the desperate avoided those streets. She'd also learned cruelty in ways she'd never imagined. "Look at that one," a merchant's wife had sneered last week, pulling her child away as Lyra passed. "Don't stare, darling. That's what happens when you steal and lie. That's what becomes of girls with no morals," the child had asked, innocent and curious. "But, Mama, how do you know she stole?" "Because she wouldn't be on the streets if she hadn't done something terrible. The world is just sweet one. Good people prosper, bad people suffer." Lyra had walked faster, but the words followed her like ghosts. "Is that what I am now? A cautionary tale for children?" Tonight her path took her toward the merchant quarter, where the smell of fresh bread from the morning's baking still lingered faintly in the air. She knew the baker's routine. He dumped his day-old goods in the bins behind his shop just after sunset. If she timed it right, she could get there before the other street dwellers caught the scent. But as she turned the corner, her heart sank. 3 figures already surrounded the bins, their voices raised in argument over who had the right to the scraps. One of them was Marcus, a former soldier who'd lost his leg in the border wars and now survived on charity that dried up the moment people stopped looking at him with pity. Another was an old woman everyone called Granny Silt, though Lyra doubted that was her real name. The third was someone new, a young man with wild eyes and the desperate energy of someone who hadn't yet learned the rules of the streets. Marcus saw her first. "Back off, girl. We were here first." Lyra raised her hands in surrender. She wasn't stupid enough to fight over garbage. Not when every calorie had to be carefully hoarded, not wasted in pointless conflict. She was about to turn away when the wild-eyed young man lunged forward, shoving Granny Silt aside to grab an armful of bread. The old woman fell hard, her head cracking against the cobblestones with a sound that made Lyra's stomach turn. "Hey!" Marcus roared, but the young man was already running, his stolen prize clutched to his chest. Lyra dropped to her knees beside Granny Silt. Blood pooled beneath the old woman's head, black in the dim light. Her eyes were open, but unfocused, her breathing shallow and wet. "Someone get help," Lyra said, looking up at Marcus. He shook his head slowly. "No one comes to the merchant quarter for the likes of us. You know that." "She's dying." "We're all dying, girl, just at different speeds." The truth of it hit Lyra like a fist. This was what she'd become. This was the world she now inhabited, a place where an old woman could bleed out on the street, and the only witnesses would be other desperate souls too broken to do anything but watch. Granny Silt's hand suddenly gripped Lyra's wrist with surprising strength. Her lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. Lyra leaned closer. "Don't let them make you less." Then the grip relaxed. The light faded from the old woman's eyes. Lyra sat back on her heels, shaking. She'd seen death before. Every servant in the palace had during the fever that swept through 2 winters ago. But this was different. This was death without dignity, without witness, without anyone to mark that a human being had stopped existing. Marcus gathered Granny Silt's worn shawl and draped it over her face with surprising gentleness. "You should go," he said to Lyra. "Patrols find a body, they start asking questions. Street folk around a corpse, they don't ask gentle." Lyra nodded numbly and stood. Her legs felt like water. She walked without direction, letting her feet carry her through the labyrinth of streets she'd come to know in the dark. The cold bit deeper now, or maybe she was just feeling it more after watching life drain away into the cracks between cobblestones. Don't let them make you less. But wasn't that exactly what had happened? Every day on the street stripped away another layer of who she'd been. The girl who'd believed in fairness and justice. The girl who'd thought hard work and honesty mattered. The girl who'd looked at the world and seen opportunity instead of endless threat. That girl was dying too, piece by piece. Lyra found herself in the old quarter of the city, where buildings leaned against each other like tired old men sharing the weight of centuries. This was where she'd found her best hiding spots. Abandoned houses that hadn't quite collapsed, with broken doors and empty rooms where she could huddle in corners and pretend she was safe for a few hours. But tonight, even her usual refuge felt wrong. The walls seemed to press in closer, the darkness more suffocating than sheltering. She emerged onto a street she didn't recognize immediately. The buildings here were different, better maintained, with windows that still held glass and doors that actually locked. This was the edge of the noble quarter, where palace officials and wealthy merchants kept their townhouses. Dangerous territory. Lyra was about to retreat when she heard voices, male, multiple, coming closer. She pressed herself into a recessed doorway, making herself as small as possible. The voices grew louder, guards from the sound of it, their boots hitting the cobblestones in practiced unison. "The king walked these streets?" one was saying, disbelief clear in his tone. "Every night this week," another replied. "Lord Various says he slips out after the council meetings. No escort, no announcement, just walks like he's trying to escape his own shadow." Madness. One assassin with a steady hand and the kingdom falls apart. Maybe that's what he wants. You see his face during the council sessions? Man looks like he's already dead, just hasn't figured out how to lie down yet. They passed without seeing her, but their words lingered. King Alaric Draven, the feared ruler whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Lyra had seen him exactly once during her time at the palace, during the royal selection 3 months ago, when noble families from across the realm had brought their daughters to be considered as potential queens. Lyra hadn't been part of the selection, of course. She was just a servant tasked with keeping the wine glasses full and the refreshment tables stocked. Invisible, as servants were meant to be. But she'd looked up at the wrong moment and met his eyes. It had lasted maybe 2 seconds, that accidental connection across a crowded hall. His eyes were gray, she remembered, storm gray, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He'd looked at her like she was the only real person in a room full of carefully constructed performances. Then someone had called his name and the moment shattered. He'd turned back to the noble daughters with their practiced smiles and rehearsed conversations, and Lyra had returned to being invisible. She'd thought about that moment sometimes during the first week on the streets, when hunger and cold hadn't yet completely consumed her capacity for memory. Wondered what it meant that a king could look at a servant and see a person. Wondered if it meant anything at all, or if she'd just imagined the recognition in his eyes because she'd been desperate to feel seen. It didn't matter now. Kings lived in one world, and she lived in another. Those worlds had briefly touched, but they would never truly meet. Lyra waited until the guard patrol's voices faded completely, then stepped back into the street. She needed to find somewhere to sleep before the temperature dropped any further. Her body was already shaking, whether from cold or the shock of watching Granny Silt die, she wasn't sure. She'd made it maybe 20 steps when she heard it. Footsteps. Singular. Deliberate. Not a patrol's marching rhythm, but something else. Someone walking alone with purpose. Lyra turned, ready to run, and found herself face to face with King Alaric Draven. He stopped 3 paces away, and for a moment neither of them moved. He was dressed simply, no crown, no royal regalia, just dark clothes that could belong to any wealthy merchant. But there was no mistaking him. The way he carried himself, the way the shadows seemed to gather around him like subjects awaiting command. His eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. "You," he said, and his voice was nothing like she'd expected. Not the commanding boom of a king addressing subjects, but something quieter, almost careful. From the selection hall, Lyra's mouth had gone completely dry. She should bow. She should speak. She should do something other than stand there like a terrified animal caught in lantern light. But words wouldn't come. All she could think was that a king stood before her while she was covered in filth and smelled of garbage and desperation. The gulf between what she'd been and what she'd become had never felt wider. "What happened to you?" Alaric asked, and the genuine concern in his voice was somehow worse than contempt would have been. That broke something in her. "What happened?" Lyra heard herself laugh, a sound sharp and broken as shattered glass. "I fell, Your Majesty, all the way down, and no one caught me. No one even tried." She shouldn't be speaking to him like this. A servant didn't address a king with bitterness in her voice, didn't let pain show through like blood through bandages. But what more could they take from her? She had nothing left to lose. Alaric took a step closer, and she saw him truly look at her, not the glance of nobility acknowledging a servant's presence, but actual seeing. His gaze traveled over her hollow cheeks, her matted hair, her bleeding hands. Something flickered across his face. Anger, maybe, or recognition of a different kind. "Who did this?" he asked. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." And the terrible thing was, he sounded like he meant it. Lyra felt something crack inside her chest, the final wall she'd built between herself and the grief of everything she'd lost. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She'd learned not to cry on the streets. Tears were luxury, water her body couldn't afford to waste. Lady Morgana accused me of stealing her necklace, she said, her voice flat and hollow. It was found in my quarters. I was expelled from the palace. That was 3 weeks ago. Now I'm this. She gestured to herself, to the wreckage she'd become. A cautionary tale. A lesson in what happens when servants forget their place. Alaric's jaw tightened. Morgana. He said the name like a curse. My cousin. Yes, and you didn't steal the necklace. It wasn't a question, but Lyra answered anyway. No, Your Majesty, I didn't. I believe you. The simplicity of those 3 words nearly destroyed her. When was the last time someone had believed her? When was the last time someone had looked at her and chosen to see truth instead of convenience? The nobles at the palace had believed Lady Morgana because it was easier, because it fit their understanding of how the world worked. Noble ladies didn't lie. Servants did. The people on the streets didn't believe anything at all. They just survived. But this man, this king who could have walked past her without even noticing she existed, stood in the cold night and said he believed her. Why? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes holding hers. Because I remember the selection hall. I remember every face in that room, all those practiced smiles and calculated glances, everyone performing their role, saying what they thought I wanted to hear. Except you. He paused. You looked at me like I was human, not a crown or a conquest or a stepping stone to power, just human. Lyra had forgotten that moment in the chaos of survival, but now it came back with crystal clarity. The way his eyes had found hers across the crowded hall, the flash of something real passing between them before duty pulled them back to their separate worlds. I was just serving wine, she said. You were the only honest thing in that entire room. The weight of his words settled between them like snow, soft at first, then impossible to ignore. Your Majesty, Lyra began, but he raised a hand. Alaric. Just Alaric for tonight. I'm not a king in these streets. I'm just a man who's tired of gilded cages and poisoned honey. She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to reconcile the fearsome ruler she'd heard stories about with this man who walked alone through dangerous streets like he was looking for something he'd lost. You're cold, he observed. Not a question, a fact. I'm always cold now. And hungry. Always that too. Alaric reached inside his cloak and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. I was going to eat this myself, but he held it out to her. Please. Lyra stared at the offered package. Inside would be food, real food, not garbage or scraps. Her body screamed at her to take it, to grab it and run before he changed his mind. But something made her hesitate. Why are you doing this? She asked. Because watching someone suffer when you have the power to help and choosing to do nothing? He shook his head. That's not power. That's just cruelty with a crown on. She took the package with trembling hands. Inside was bread, fresh bread, still soft, and cheese and dried meat. More food than she'd seen in 3 weeks. The smell of it made her dizzy. Eat, Alaric said gently. I can wait. She wanted to eat slowly, to savor each bite, to make it last. But hunger had its own logic. She devoured the food like a starving animal, barely tasting it, her body desperate for the calories that might keep her alive another day. Alaric watched without judgment, and somehow that was worse than if he'd looked away in disgust. When she finished, he spoke again. The palace is 10 minutes from here. You could be warm tonight, safe, fed. Lyra's heart lurched. Your Majesty, Alaric, they expelled me. If I go back, they'll do exactly what I tell them to do, he said. And for the first time she heard the steel beneath the gentleness. The voice of a man who'd ruled a kingdom through wars and betrayals and countless challenges to his throne. I'm giving you a choice, Lyra Vance. You can stay here in the cold, fighting for scraps, and watching your humanity die piece by piece. Or you can come with me. Why? She asked again, because she needed to understand. Why me? Why now? You could have any servant, any... Because 3 months ago you looked at me and saw a person. Tonight, I looked at you and saw the same. And because if I walk away now, knowing what was done to you, knowing you're innocent, he paused, his jaw tight, then I'm not the king I'm trying to be. I'm just another tyrant in a crown, letting injustice happen because it's convenient. Lyra stood at a crossroads she'd never imagined. Behind her, the streets, the cold, the slow death of everything she'd once been. Before her, a return to the palace, to safety and food and warmth, but also to the place that had cast her out, to Lady Morgana and all the nobles who'd watched her fall without lifting a finger. "They'll hate me for coming back," she said. "They'll hate you anyway. Might as well be warm while they do it." Despite everything, the hunger, the exhaustion, the bone-deep despair that had become her constant companion, Lyra felt something impossible stir in her chest. Hope. Dangerous, foolish, probably fatal hope. "If I come back," she said slowly, Lady Morgana will answer to me." Alaric's voice cut through the night like a blade. "As will everyone else who had a hand in this. I promise you that." Promises from kings were supposed to be as solid as stone, as unbreakable as iron. But Lyra had learned that promises meant nothing in a world built on lies and convenience. Still, she thought of Granny Silt's last words, "Don't let them make you less." Staying on the streets would kill her. Maybe not tonight or tomorrow, but soon. She could feel it in the way her body was already starting to fail, in the way each breath came harder than the last. The streets were a slow execution, and she was already halfway to the gallows. Going back to the palace was a gamble. It might be a trap. It might be another kind of death, slower, more humiliating. But it might also be a chance, and chances she'd learned were rarer than gold. "Okay," Lyra whispered. "Okay." Alaric's expression softened, not quite a smile, but something warmer than she'd seen before. "Can you walk?" "I've been walking for weeks. I can make it 10 more minutes." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. The support was embarrassing but necessary. Her legs were shaking badly now, whether from cold or emotion or simple exhaustion, she couldn't tell. They walked through streets that had become her hunting ground, her prison, her world. But with Alaric beside her, they looked different, less hostile, less final. Guards saw them coming and snapped to attention, their eyes widening at the sight of their king escorting what looked like a street beggar. But none dared question him. The palace gates loomed before them, the same gates she'd been thrown out of 3 weeks ago. Lyra's steps faltered. "I've got you," Alaric said quietly. "Trust me." So she did. They crossed the threshold together, and with each step, Lyra felt the streets releasing their hold on her. Not completely. Those scars would never fully fade, but enough to breathe, enough to hope. Inside, the palace blazed with light and warmth that felt almost painful after so long in the cold. Servants stopped mid-task to stare. Nobles emerging from a late council session froze in shock. And there, descending the grand staircase in a gown of midnight blue, was Lady Morgana. She saw Alaric first, and her face lit up with a practiced smile. Then she saw Lyra, and the smile froze, hardening into something ugly. "Your Majesty," Morgana said, her voice honey over ice. "What is that doing here?" Alaric's expression could have carved mountains. "This is Lyra Vance. She's returned as my personal guest. Prepare the East Wing quarters for her. Now." "But she's a thief. She was expelled for—" "She was framed," Alaric said, each word precise and cold as winter. "And you're going to tell me exactly how it happened. We'll start with where you really got that necklace you claimed was stolen." The color drained from Morgana's face. Around them, the assembled nobles began whispering, a sound like wind through dead leaves. Lyra stood beside the king, filthy and hollow-eyed and more terrified than she'd ever been on the streets. Because this was different. This was hope, fragile as glass. And if it shattered now— But Alaric didn't waver. His hand remained steady on her arm, his presence a wall between her and everyone who wanted her gone. "Get her cleaned up," he ordered a nearby servant who stood gaping. "Food, clean clothes, a warm bed. She's under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me directly." The servant hurried forward, barely concealing shock. Right away, Your Majesty. This way, miss. Lyra looked up at Alaric, questions burning in her eyes. He met her gaze and gave the slightest nod. Rest tonight. Tomorrow we deal with the truth. She wanted to thank him, to say something that captured the magnitude of what he'd just done. But words felt too small, so she simply nodded back and let herself be led away. As she climbed the stairs toward what used to be impossible and what might be salvation, Lyra heard Lady Morgana's voice behind her, sharp with barely controlled panic. Alaric, you don't understand. The council will never... The council, the king said softly, dangerously, will do exactly as I command, as will you, cousin, as will everyone in this palace who forgot that justice matters more than convenience. Lyra didn't hear the rest. She was being ushered through familiar corridors that looked different now, brighter, warmer, full of possibility instead of just duty. The servant, a young woman named Clara, who Lyra vaguely recognized from before, helped her into the East Wing quarters. The room was smaller than a noble's suite, but larger than the servant quarters she'd shared. A fire already crackled in the hearth. Fresh water steamed in a copper tub. I'll help you bathe, Clara said quietly. Then food. The king's orders were very specific about the food. Lyra let herself be undressed, too exhausted to feel embarrassment. The warm water was almost painful against her frozen skin, but it was the good kind of pain, the kind that meant feeling returning to numb places. As Clara gently washed weeks of street filth from her hair, Lyra stared at the fire and tried to understand what had just happened. A king had found her in an alley, had believed her, had brought her back to the palace against all tradition and sense, had faced down his own family to protect her. It was impossible. It was real. And tomorrow, when the sun rose, she would have to face the consequences of this impossible reality. The nobles who wanted her gone, the family who'd framed her, the entire system that had cast her out without a second thought. But tonight she was warm. Tonight she was safe. Tonight she wasn't alone. Lyra closed her eyes and let the warmth seep into her bones, washing away the cold that had lived there for 3 weeks. Whatever came next, she would face it. But for now, for this one fragile moment, she allowed herself to hope. And somewhere in the palace, a king stood before his council and began the dangerous work of proving that justice mattered more than blood, more than tradition, more than the comfortable lies that let good people sleep while innocents suffered. The storm was coming, but for the first time since her fall, Lyra wasn't facing it alone. Lyra woke to sunlight streaming through windows she'd forgotten could be clean. For 3 heartbeats, she thought she was still on the streets, that the warmth and softness surrounding her was just another fever dream brought on by starvation. Then her eyes focused on the embroidered canopy above her bed, the fire crackling in the hearth, the tray of fresh bread and fruit someone had left on the bedside table while she slept. Real. It was all horrifyingly, impossibly real. She sat up too quickly and the room spun. Her body, used to operating on nothing, didn't know what to do with actual rest and food. Every muscle ached with the deep exhaustion that comes after survival mode finally releases its grip. A soft knock at the door made her freeze. "Miss Vance?" Clara's voice, gentle and careful. "The king requests your presence in the small council chamber. I've brought clothes." The king. The council. Reality crashed back like a wave of ice water. Lyra's hands shook as she dressed in the simple but well-made gown Clara had brought. Deep gray wool, appropriate for someone who wasn't nobility but wasn't quite a servant either. A woman in limbo, which was exactly what she was. Clara worked quietly to tame Lyra's hair into something presentable, her fingers gentle where the tangles were worst. When she finished, she stepped back and studied Lyra with an expression that might have been sympathy. "They're going to try to break you in there," Clara said softly. "The nobles, Lady Morgana especially. She's been working the council all morning, calling in favors, making threats." She paused. "But the king, I've never seen him like this. Like something finally matters to him." "What do you mean?" Clara glanced at the door, then leaned closer. "King Alaric has always been fair but distant, like he's going through the motions of ruling without actually caring about any of it. But last night when he brought you in," she shook her head, "he looked alive for the first time in years. And that's terrifying half the palace because a king who cares is a king who can't be controlled." The words settled in Lyra's stomach like stones. She wasn't just fighting for her own vindication anymore. She'd somehow become a symbol of something larger, something dangerous. "I didn't ask for any of this," she whispered. "No one asks for the moments that define them," Clara said. "They just happen, and we either rise to meet them or get crushed beneath them." She squeezed Lyra's hand once, quick and reassuring. "Don't let them make you small again. You've survived worse than words." The walk to the council chamber felt endless. Servants stopped their work to stare as Lyra passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. She heard whispers following her like shadows. The nerve of her, coming back. "The king's lost his mind, letting street filth into the palace. 3 weeks on the streets and she thinks she can just—" Lyra kept her eyes forward and her spine straight. Clara was right. She'd survived actual starvation, bone-deep cold, watching a woman die on the cobblestones. A few whispered insults were nothing. The guards outside the council chamber doors gave her looks that could have curdled milk, but they opened the doors without comment. Inside, 12 pairs of eyes turned to assess her. The small council chamber was less grand than the throne room, but somehow more intimidating. A long table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs occupied by the most powerful nobles in the realm. Lords and ladies who controlled armies, trade routes, entire provinces. People who could crush her with a word. At the head of the table sat King Alaric, his expression unreadable. To his right was an elderly man in burgundy robes who must be Lord Chancellor Various. To his left, resplendent in midnight blue silk, sat Lady Morgana. Her face was composed into perfect noble neutrality, but her eyes burned with fury when they landed on Lyra. "Ah, the guest of honor," drawled a heavy-set lord with a beard like gray steel. "Tell me, your majesty, is it customary now to invite criminals to council proceedings?" "Lord Blackwood," Alaric said calmly, "if you're going to insult someone, at least have the courage to do it to their face rather than hiding behind rhetorical questions." Lord Blackwood's face reddened, but he subsided into hostile silence. Alaric gestured to an empty chair near the foot of the table. "Lyra, please sit." She did, feeling the weight of every stare like hands pressing down on her shoulders. The chair was too fine, the company too dangerous, and she was too aware of how recently she'd been sleeping in alleys to feel like she belonged anywhere near this table. "Now," Alaric said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we're going to discuss what happened 3 weeks ago, and we're going to arrive at the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth makes certain people." "Your Majesty," Lady Morgana began, her voice perfectly pitched between concern and wounded dignity, "I understand your compassion toward the less fortunate, truly I do. But this girl was caught with stolen property. The evidence was clear. To drag this matter up again only—" "The evidence," Alaric interrupted, "was a necklace found in her trunk. A necklace that she had no motive to steal and no means to sell. Strange, isn't it? That a servant who'd worked at the palace for 2 years without incident would suddenly risk everything for a piece of jewelry she couldn't possibly benefit from?" "Desperation makes people foolish," offered a thin-faced lady across the table. "Perhaps she thought she could—" "Lady Wessex, when exactly did you last speak to a desperate person?" Alaric's tone could have frozen fire. "I have. Recently, in fact. And I can tell you that the truly desperate are far too focused on survival to waste energy on pointless theft." Lyra's throat tightened. He was defending her, but the casual mention of their meeting in the alley made her feel exposed, vulnerable in ways she couldn't name. Lord Chancellor Various cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, while your empathy is admirable, we cannot simply overturn a judgment without substantial evidence to the contrary. The girl was found with the necklace. Whether we believe she intended to steal it or not, the facts remain." "The facts," Lyra heard herself say, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, "are that I never touched that necklace until the guards pulled it from my trunk, and I know exactly who put it there." Silence crashed down like a guillotine blade. She should have stayed quiet, should have let Alaric handle this. But something about sitting in this room full of powerful people who'd condemned her without a second thought ignited a fury she thought the streets had beaten out of her. "You forget yourself, girl," Lord Blackwood growled. "You don't speak in council unless— Unless what?" Lyra stood, her chair scraping back. 3 weeks ago, she would have been terrified. Now she was too angry to care. Unless I'm accused, I was accused plenty 3 weeks ago, and no one cared what I had to say then. So forgive me if I don't wait for permission now. Lyra. Alaric's voice held a note of warning, but also something else. Approval, maybe. Or curiosity about how far she'd go. She turned to Lady Morgana, who sat frozen in perfect noble composure. You framed me because the king looked at me during the selection. Just for a moment, just a glance. But it was enough to make you afraid. Morgana's laugh was like ice breaking. Afraid? Of a servant? Darling, you vastly overestimate your importance. Then why go to such lengths to destroy me? Lyra demanded. Why plant the necklace? Why make such a performance of grief? If I was nothing, why not just ignore me? Because you were stealing. Morgana's composure cracked just slightly. The evidence was found in my locked trunk that only palace staff had keys to. Lyra took a step closer to the table. Tell them about the maid. The one you paid to plant the necklace and then sent away to your country estate the very next day. What was her name again? Elise? She was gambling now, building on fragments she'd overheard from other servants before her expulsion. But Morgana's face went pale as bone, and Lyra knew she'd struck gold. That's absurd, Morgana stammered. Elise left for personal reasons. Summon her, Alaric said quietly. The 2 words fell like an executioner's axe. Send riders to my cousin's estate. Bring this Elise back to the palace. Today. Your Majesty, really, this is beneath the dignity of the council, Lord Chancellor Varius began. What's beneath the dignity of this council, Alaric said, standing now, is that we condemned a woman without trial, without investigation, based on the word of a noble against a servant. We didn't question. We didn't verify. We simply assumed that blood and title made truth. His gray eyes swept the room. I'm ashamed of us all, including myself. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Kings didn't admit shame. Kings didn't question their own judgments. Lady Wessex found her voice first. Your Majesty, even if, and I'm not conceding this point, even if Lady Morgana did fabricate evidence, the girl is still just a servant. To elevate this matter to such importance, to bring her into council chambers, to treat her as if she were... She gestured helplessly at Lyra. It sets a dangerous precedent. You're right, Alaric said, and Lyra's heart plummeted. It does set a precedent. The precedent that justice matters regardless of station, that truth matters more than convenience, that we don't get to destroy lives simply because it's easier than confronting uncomfortable facts. But the stability of the realm, Ma, began another lord. The stability of the realm, Alaric interrupted, his voice rising for the first time, rests on the people believing that the crown cares about justice. Not just for nobles, not just for the wealthy and connected, but for everyone. What stability is there in a kingdom where the powerless can be crushed on a whim? Lord Blackwood slammed his hand on the table. You're talking about upending the entire social order for one girl. I'm talking about basic decency. Alaric's composure finally cracked, revealing the anger beneath. And if basic decency upends your social order, then maybe that order deserves to fall. The room erupted, nobles shouting over each other, some in support, more in outrage. Lyra stood frozen at the center of the storm she'd helped create, watching everything spiral beyond her control. This was bigger than her vindication now. This was about power and precedent, about a king choosing principle over politics, and the nobles could smell the danger of it. Enough! Lord Chancellor Varius's voice cut through the chaos. Your Majesty, I must speak plainly. If you pursue this course, if you publicly punish Lady Morgana, if you elevate this servant to such importance, you risk alienating every noble family in the realm. They will see it as an attack on their authority, their station. You'll create enemies you can't afford. Then let them be enemies, Alaric said coldly. I'm tired of allies who are only loyal when it's convenient. Morgana stood suddenly, her face twisted with emotions she could no longer hide. You would choose her over your own blood, over family? You stopped being family the moment you framed an innocent woman to soothe your jealousy, Alaric said. And yes, Morgana, I choose justice over blood, every single time. The declaration echoed through the chamber like a bell tolling. Morgana's eyes filled with tears. Real ones this time, not the calculated performances Lyra had seen before. These were tears of rage and humiliation and fear. The court will never accept her, never. You can command their obedience, but you can't command their respect. She'll be poison in the palace, a constant reminder of your foolish sentimentality. Let them think what they want, Alaric said. I'm done caring about the opinions of people who mistake cruelty for strength. He turned to Lyra, and his expression softened just slightly. You have a choice. You can accept my protection, stay at the palace under my direct authority, and we'll see this through to the end. Or you can leave now with compensation and my apology, and I won't hold it against you. But I need to know you understand what staying means. It means becoming a target. It means every noble in this kingdom will want you gone. It means living in a place where half the people would celebrate your death. Lyra's mind flashed to the streets, to Granny Silt bleeding on the cobblestones, to Marcus and his casual acceptance that people died unmourned, to the cold that never left her bones and the hunger that never quite faded. She'd survived that. She could survive this. I stay, she said clearly. Not because I want protection or comfort. I stay because if I run now, it means they were right. It means servants are less than nobles, truth matters less than convenience, and justice only exists for people who can afford it. She looked at Morgana. I stay because I refuse to let you win. Morgana's face went from pale to flushed with fury. You little... Council dismissed, Alaric said sharply. All of you except Lady Morgana. We have family matters to discuss. The nobles filed out, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust to barely concealed excitement at the drama unfolding. Lord Blackwood stopped beside Lyra on his way out. You've made powerful enemies today, girl, he said quietly. The king can't protect you from everything. Remember that. It sounded like a threat. It probably was. When the chamber emptied, only Lyra, Alaric, and Morgana remained. The silence was suffocating. Alaric circled the table slowly, his movements predatory. Where's the necklace, Morgana? I don't know what you bet. Don't! His voice cracked like a whip. Don't lie to me. Not now. Where is it? Morgana's composure finally shattered completely. In my quarters. Hidden. But Alaric, you have to understand, I did it for you. She was just a servant who caught your eye for a moment, who made you look at her like she mattered. And I couldn't. I've been trying for years to make you see me as more than just your cousin, and then she appears, and in one glance... So you destroyed her life. Alaric's voice was flat. You had her cast onto the streets to starve because I looked at her during a party. I thought she'd find another position. I didn't think... You didn't think she'd suffer? You didn't think she'd struggle? Alaric's laugh was bitter. Or you didn't care as long as she was out of your sight? Morgana wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking smaller. What are you going to do? Publicly announce the truth, that you framed her, that the crown apologizes for the injustice, and you're going to confirm every word of it. That will destroy me, Morgana whispered. My reputation, my standing, my chances of ever... You should have thought of that before you destroyed someone else. Alaric turned away from her. You have until tomorrow to decide. Confess publicly and accept exile to your estate for 2 years, or refuse and face formal charges of conspiracy and fraud against a member of the royal household. She's not a member of the household. She is now. Alaric's tone left no room for argument. I'm assigning her to my personal staff, which means any crime against her is a crime against the crown. Choose wisely, cousin. Morgana fled, her silk skirts whispering against the stone floor. When the door closed behind her, the energy drained from the room like water from a broken cup. Alaric slumped into his chair and pressed his hands to his face. You didn't have to do that, Lyra said quietly. The personal staff thing. That makes everything more complicated. Everything's already complicated. He looked up at her, and the exhaustion in his eyes was profound. I meant what I said in there, about choosing justice over blood. But I need you to understand something, Lyra. This isn't just about proving you innocent anymore. The nobles see you as a symbol now, of me choosing common people over them, of the old order breaking down. They'll come after you in ways I can't always prevent. I know. Do you? He stood and crossed to her, stopping close enough that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes. They'll poison your food, spread rumors that you're my mistress, make your life so miserable that exile starts looking like mercy. And I can protect you from the obvious attacks, but the subtle ones. He shook his head. I'm asking you to walk into a war you didn't start, for reasons that have nothing to do with you anymore. Lyra thought about this, really thought about it. The safe choice was to take the money and run. Start over somewhere far from Thornhaven, somewhere no one knew her story. Live a quiet life free from the politics and dangers of court, but she'd learned something on the streets. Safety was an illusion. Comfort was temporary. The only thing that lasted was the choice to stand for something that mattered. My whole life I was told to be invisible, she said. To serve without being seen, to exist without taking up space. And when I was accused, I disappeared just like they wanted. I became nothing. She met his eyes. I won't do that again. Whatever happens, at least I'll face it as someone who mattered enough to fight for. Something shifted in Alaric's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. You're braver than most of my soldiers. I'm terrified, she admitted, but I'm also angry. And anger is easier to live with than fear. A knock at the door interrupted them. A guard entered and bowed. Your Majesty, the riders have returned from Lady Morgana's estate. They've brought the maid Elise. That was fast, Alaric said. She was apparently waiting at the gate, sire. Said she'd been expecting to be summoned. Interesting, Lyra thought. Very interesting. Elise was a small woman in her 30s, with nervous hands and eyes that darted like trapped birds. She curtsied awkwardly when brought before them, her whole body trembling. You're not in trouble, Alaric said gently. I need you to tell me the truth about the necklace, about what Lady Morgana asked you to do. Elise's face crumpled. I'm so sorry. I never wanted... She said it was just a prank, that she'd call it off before anything serious happened. She paid me 6 months' wages to put the necklace in Miss Vance's trunk and then leave for the country before questions could be asked. But it wasn't a prank, Lyra said. No. Elise looked at her with tears streaming down her face. I realized that when I heard you'd been expelled, I wanted to come back, to tell the truth, but I was afraid. Lady Morgana said if I ever spoke about it, she'd make sure I never worked again. She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. I've been sick with guilt every day since. When I saw the riders coming, I knew, and I was almost relieved. Alaric exchanged a look with Lyra. You'll testify to this publicly? Yes, Your Majesty. Whatever you need. I can't carry this anymore. Thank you, Lyra said softly, and meant it. That took courage. Elise shook her head. No, miss. Real courage was you coming back here. I heard the servants talking. They say half the palace wants you dead, and the other half thinks you're either very brave or very stupid. She managed a weak smile. I think maybe it's both. After Elise was escorted to quarters where she'd be kept safe until the public testimony, Lyra found herself alone with Alaric again. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Tomorrow, Alaric said, I'll make the announcement. Morgana will confess, Elise will testify, and the record will be corrected. You'll be officially restored to the palace with full honors. And then the real war begins, Lyra said. Yes. He didn't try to soften it. The nobles will test you. They'll push and prod and try to find your breaking point. Some will be subtle, others direct. All of them will be watching to see if you're worthy of the stand I've taken for you. Are you having second thoughts? About justice? Never. He paused. About putting you in danger, constantly. Lyra surprised herself by reaching out and touching his arm. The gesture felt simultaneously too familiar and absolutely necessary. I made my choice. You gave me that much, the chance to choose. I won't waste it. His hand covered hers, warm and solid. Then we face it together. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither could say. There were rules about kings and servants, about stations and propriety. But those rules felt distant and hollow compared to the connection that had formed between them, first in a glance across a crowded hall, then in an alley where he'd chosen to see her as human, and now in this quiet chamber where they were preparing to fight the entire world. A bell tolled somewhere in the palace, breaking the spell. Alaric stepped back, and the distance felt like miles. You should rest. Tomorrow will be difficult. Tomorrow will be war, Lyra corrected, but I've survived worse. Have you? She thought of the streets, the cold, the slow death of hope. Then she thought of the nobles who'd condemned her, the whispers that would follow her, the daggers hidden behind silk smiles. I'm about to find out, she said. That night, Lyra stood at her window and looked out over the city. Somewhere down there were the alleys she'd hidden in, the bins she'd scavenged from, the streets that had taught her exactly how much a human life was worth to people who had everything. She'd survived that world by becoming invisible, by making herself nothing. Now she was being asked to be seen, to stand at the center of a storm and refuse to break. The old Lyra would have been terrified. The girl who'd polish silver and serve tea and believed that good work and honest effort mattered. But that girl had died in the alleys. The woman who returned was harder, sharper, forged in hunger and cold, and the absolute clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. Tomorrow the nobles would try to destroy her with words and schemes and the weight of centuries of tradition. Let them try. She'd already survived the worst they could do. She'd already touched bottom and found it wasn't death. It was choice. The choice to stand up one more time. The choice to fight even when fighting seemed pointless. The choice to matter even when the world insisted she was nothing. Lyra turned from the window and lay down in the soft bed that still felt wrong against her street-hardened body. Tomorrow she would stand before the entire court and watch justice, real justice, the kind that didn't care about blood or title, finally happen. And then the real battle would begin. But tonight, for this one last moment of peace, she let herself feel something she hadn't allowed in weeks. Hope. Dangerous, defiant, absolutely unbreakable hope. The storm was coming. Let it come. She woke to the sound of breaking glass. Lyra bolted upright in the pre-dawn darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs with the practiced terror of someone who'd learned to wake ready to run. The streets had taught her that the difference between alert sleep and death was often measured in seconds. Another crash, closer this time. Then voices, angry and slurred with drink. Come out, whore! Let's see the king's new plaything. Street trash thinks she belongs in the palace. Show us what you did to earn a bed in the East Wing. Lyra was already moving, pulling on the gray dress from yesterday with hands that only shook a little. The window showed torchlight in the courtyard below. A crowd of young nobles, maybe a dozen strong, their faces flushed with wine and entitlement. A rock sailed through her window, showering the floor with crystalline shards. She should call for guards, should hide, should do what any sensible person would do when faced with a mob of drunk aristocrats looking for blood. Instead, Lyra walked to the broken window and looked down at them. If you're going to murder me, she called out, her voice cutting through their drunken jeering, at least have the courage to do it in daylight, or are you only brave when the sun's down and the wine's flowing? The crowd went silent. Then one of them, a young lord with a face like a disappointed ferret, laughed. She's got spine, I'll give her that. Stupid, but spine. Spine won't save her when the council rejects the king's madness, another shouted. We don't kneel to servants. Then don't kneel, Lyra shot back. Stand, fall, run away. I don't care what you do, as long as you do it somewhere else. Some of us need sleep. More rocks flew. One caught her shoulder, sending sharp pain radiating down her arm. But she didn't flinch, didn't step back from the window. On the streets, showing fear was an invitation to worse violence. The same logic applied here, just with better clothes and more elaborate vocabulary. Enough. The single word cut through the chaos like a sword through silk. King Alaric emerged from the shadows of the courtyard, still dressed in his council robes from whatever late-night session he'd been trapped in. Behind him came a dozen palace guards, their expressions cold and professional. Disperse, now, or spend the rest of the week in the dungeon cells contemplating the definition of assault on crown personnel. The nobles scattered like roaches when the lantern swings close. Within moments, the courtyard stood empty except for Alaric and his guards. He looked up at Lyra's window, and even from this distance, she could see the fury in his eyes. Not at her. For her. She stepped back from the window as footsteps thundered up the stairs. A moment later, Alaric burst through her door, his composure completely shattered. Are you hurt? Just a bruise. She touched her shoulder gingerly. I've had worse. That's not the point. He crossed to the window, staring at the broken glass scattered across the floor. This is supposed to be the safest place in the kingdom. You're supposed to be protected here. Alaric. She used his name deliberately, watching him focus on her instead of his rage. It's one night, one group of drunk idiots. I survived 3 weeks on the streets. I can handle some rocks and insults. You shouldn't have to. He turned to face her fully, and the rawness in his expression made her chest tighten. Every day it gets worse. The whispers, the threats, the accidents that keep happening around you. Yesterday, someone put glass shards in your breakfast porridge. The day before, you nearly fell down a staircase that someone had oiled. And now this. Then let me leave. The words came out before she could stop them. Let me take the money you offered and disappear. Start over somewhere they've never heard of Thornhaven or thieving servants or kings who choose justice over politics. Is that what you want? Lyra looked at the broken window, the scattered glass catching the first hints of dawn light like frozen tears. What I want doesn't matter. What matters is that tomorrow you're going to announce the truth about Morgana, and the nobles are going to see it as the first crack in the foundation of everything they believe in. And they'll do whatever it takes to stop that crack from spreading. Let them try. Alaric's voice hardened back into the tone of a king. Tomorrow changes everything. Tomorrow the truth comes out. Morgana faces consequences, and we prove that justice isn't just a word we use to make ourselves feel noble while doing whatever's convenient. And if the council refuses to accept it, then I remind them who wears the crown. The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it terrified her, because she'd learned on the streets that certainty was dangerous. Certainty got you killed. You're gambling your throne on me, she said quietly. On a servant you barely know, for a principle that most people abandoned decades ago. Why? Alaric was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, softer, more human. Because when I found you in that alley, you looked at me the same way you did in the selection hall, like I was a person, not a crown. And I realized I'd spent years surrounded by people who saw me as an opportunity, or an obstacle, or a means to an end, but never as... He trailed off. You made me remember what it felt like to be real. I won't apologize for fighting for that. The words hung between them, heavy with meanings neither could fully speak. There were rules about kings and servants, about proper distance and appropriate feelings. But those rules seemed increasingly absurd when standing in a room filled with broken glass, talking about survival and truth and the courage to care about things that mattered. A guard appeared at the door. Your Majesty, Lord Chancellor Various requests an urgent meeting. He says it concerns tomorrow's announcement. Alaric's expression shuddered back into royal neutrality. Tell him I'll be there shortly. He looked at Lyra. Get some rest. Tomorrow we make history, or we burn trying. Those aren't mutually exclusive, she pointed out. No, he agreed. They're really not. After he left, Lyra sat on her bed and stared at the broken window until the sun rose properly. She didn't bother trying to sleep. Sleep was for people who felt safe, and she'd learned too much about the world to ever feel that way again. The morning of the announcement arrived like an execution day. Clara helped Lyra dress in a gown of deep blue wool, simple but well made, walking the careful line between servant and nobility that seemed to define Lyra's entire existence now. Her hands trembled as she fastened the clasps. The whole palace is talking about nothing else, Clara said, braiding Lyra's hair with practiced efficiency. Half of them think the king's lost his mind. The other half think you've bewitched him somehow. What do you think? Clara met her eyes in the mirror. I think you're the bravest person I've ever met, and I think today is going to change the kingdom, one way or another. The Great Hall was packed when Lyra arrived. Every noble within a day's ride of the capital had somehow materialized overnight, drawn by the promise of scandal and the king's mysterious announcement. They filled the gilded space like carrion birds circling fresh death. Lyra stood at the side of the dais where Alaric sat in state, her position deliberately ambiguous. Not quite a servant, not quite a guest. Just visible enough to draw every eye in the room. The whispers were like wind through dry leaves. That's her? Looks half-starved still. Imagine the audacity. The king must be desperate for... Silence. Alaric's voice cut through the murmuring like a blade. He stood, and the entire hall went quiet. Today we address an injustice committed by this court. 3 weeks ago, Lyra Vance was expelled from the palace on charges of theft. The evidence seemed clear. The judgment seemed just. We were wrong. A ripple of shock moved through the assembled nobles like a wave. The theft was fabricated, the evidence planted. Miss Vance was framed by someone who saw her as a threat, and we, this court, including myself, failed to question, failed to investigate, failed to ensure that truth mattered more than convenience. Lord Blackwood rose from his seat. Your Majesty, surely you're not suggesting we overturn a lawful judgment on the word of the actual thief, Alaric interrupted. Lady Morgana Draven, step forward. Morgana rose from her seat near the front, her face a mask of noble composure barely hiding the terror beneath. She walked to the center of the hall like a woman approaching her own gallows. Tell them, Alaric commanded. Tell them what you did. For a moment, Lyra thought Morgana might refuse, might call his bluff, force him to choose between family and justice in front of the entire court. But Morgana was a survivor too, in her own way. She knew when the game was lost. I framed Lyra Vance for theft, Morgana said, her voice barely audible. I paid a maid to plant my necklace in her trunk and then claimed it was stolen. I did this because, she swallowed hard, because I was jealous. Because the king looked at her during the selection and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen when he looked at me. The hall erupted. Nobles shouting over each other, some in outrage, others in vindication, all of them stunned by a confession they'd never expected to hear. Order, Lord Chancellor Varius bellowed. We will have order! When the chaos subsided to angry muttering, Alaric continued. Lady Morgana will be exiled to her country estate for 2 years. The maid Elise, who cooperated with the investigation, will face no charges, and Lyra Vance is hereby restored to the palace with full honors and appointed to my personal household staff. This is madness. Lord Blackwood was on his feet again. Your Majesty, you cannot seriously expect us to accept a servant in the royal household simply because she was wrongly accused. I expect, Alaric said coldly, that you will accept justice when it's served, regardless of who benefits. Or do you only believe in fairness when it applies to people of your own station? This isn't about justice. A new voice, Lady Wessex, her thin face flushed with anger. This is about you rejecting every suitable candidate presented to you and instead fixating on a common girl who what? Alaric's voice dropped to something dangerous. Who survived 3 weeks of starvation and cold? Who stood before this council and refused to bow? Who showed more courage in adversity than most of you have shown in your entire comfortable lives? She's a servant, someone shouted from the back. She's a person, Alaric shot back, and if you can't see that, then you're exactly the problem I'm trying to fix. Lord Chancellor Varius stood, his expression grave. Your Majesty, perhaps we should discuss this matter in private council before— No. Alaric's single word silenced the room. We discuss it here now in front of everyone, because that's how justice should work. In the light, where everyone can see it, not in back rooms where truth gets negotiated away for political convenience. The Chancellor's face hardened. Then let me speak plainly, Your Majesty. The noble families who support your reign are deeply troubled by this course of action. They see it as an attack on the social order that keeps this kingdom stable, and they are beginning to question whether you are fit to rule if you prioritize sentiment over statecraft. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Are you suggesting, Alaric said very quietly, that the council is considering removing me? The silence that followed could have cut diamonds. Varius didn't flinch. I'm suggesting that a king who alienates every noble family in the realm may find his crown rests less securely than he believes. Tradition exists for a reason, Your Majesty. The moment we start elevating servants and punishing nobility on a whim, it's not a whim. Lyra's voice rang out before she could stop herself. Every head in the hall swiveled to stare at her. It's called having principles. But I understand that's a foreign concept to most of you. How dare you? Lady Wessex shrieked. You forget yourself, girl. No, Lyra said, stepping forward even though her legs shook. I remember myself perfectly. I remember being thrown out of the palace to starve based on a lie. I remember watching an old woman die on the street while people stepped over her body like it was trash. I remember every single moment of what your stable social order looks like from the bottom. She turned to address the entire hall. You want to talk about tradition? Your tradition says I'm worthless because I was born without a title. Your tradition says justice only matters for people who can afford it. Your tradition is built on the backs of people like me, and you get angry when one of us survives long enough to point out how rotten the foundation is. That's enough, Lord Blackwood growled, starting toward her. Stay where you are. Alaric's command froze the Lord mid-step. She has as much right to speak in this hall as anyone, more since she's the one you all condemned without trial. She's making a mockery of everything this court stands for, someone shouted. Good, Alaric said simply. Maybe this court needs to be mocked. Maybe we need someone to stand here and remind us that our comfort is built on other people's suffering, and that's not strength, it's cowardice. Lord Chancellor Varys's expression was grim. Your Majesty, I must formally request that you reconsider this course of action. For the stability of the realm, for the unity of the noble houses, for what? Alaric demanded. For the convenience of people who don't want to be reminded that their privilege isn't the same as virtue? I'm done caring about their comfort, Varys. I'm done pretending that tradition is sacred when it's really just an excuse to avoid doing what's right. The Chancellor drew himself up to his full height. Then I must inform you that the Council will be convening an emergency session to discuss whether your judgment is sufficiently sound to continue leading this kingdom. The threat was explicit now. They were talking about deposition, about removing a king who wouldn't play by their rules. The hall went deadly silent. Alaric looked at Varys for a long moment, and Lyra saw something shift in his expression. Not fear exactly, more like a man who'd been waiting for this moment and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Convene your session, he said quietly. Take your vote. Question my judgment all you want. But understand this. I'm not backing down. Justice was done here today. And if you want to remove me for that, then you'll have to live with what that says about all of you. He turned to Lyra, and his eyes held something that looked almost like apology. I need to speak with you, privately, now. They left the hall together through a side door, leaving behind a crowd of nobles who just watched their king choose a servant over the entire aristocracy. The whispers followed them like ghosts. Alaric led her to a small room off the main corridor, some kind of archive or storage space, lined with dusty books and forgotten maps. He closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly looking exhausted. They're actually going to do it, Lyra said. They're going to try to remove you. Yes, because of me. Because you chose to give me justice. Because I chose to stand for something that matters. He met her eyes. But yes, you were the catalyst. Lyra's mind raced. Then take it back. Tell them you made a mistake, that you were testing them, or I won't lie. Even if it costs you the throne? Especially then. Alaric pushed away from the door and paced the small space like a caged animal. Do you know how many compromises I've made? How many times I've chosen political stability over doing what's right? I've spent years being the king they wanted, balanced, diplomatic, careful never to upset the delicate feelings of people who think their birth makes them better than everyone else. He stopped pacing and looked at her. And then I found you in an alley, and I remembered what it feels like to look at the world and see something worth fighting for. I'm not going back to being the king who chooses comfort over courage. Even if you lose everything? What am I losing? A crown that comes with the condition that I ignore injustice? Allies who only support me when I do what they want? Power that's only real as long as I never use it for anything that matters? He shook his head. That's not losing. That's escaping. The fierce certainty in his voice reminded Lyra of her own choice to come back to the palace. The decision to stand and fight even when running was safer. She recognized that particular brand of reckless courage because she'd felt it burning in her own chest. What happens now? She asked. The council will meet. They'll debate, scheme, make alliances. If enough of them vote against me, they can force abdication, or... He trailed off. Or what? Or civil war. He said it flatly, like he was discussing the weather. If I refuse to step down and they refuse to accept my authority, then we're in uncharted territory. The noble families have their own armies. If they decide I'm unfit to rule and I disagree, then blood gets spilled until someone wins. Lyra felt cold spread through her body. Over me, over a servant who stole a glance at the wrong moment, over the idea that justice should matter regardless of who needs it. Alaric moved closer. Don't reduce this to being about you personally. You're a symbol now of everything they fear, everything they want to suppress. If I let them destroy you, I'm telling every powerless person in this kingdom that the crown doesn't care about them, that nobility is the only thing that matters. I won't do that. But you'll risk war? War might be coming anyway. His voice was grim. The noble families have been consolidating power for years, waiting for a weak king or a succession crisis. They want to return to the old days when royalty was just the biggest noble family and everyone else scrambled for favor. Me choosing principle over politics just gave them the excuse they were looking for. A knock at the door interrupted them. A guard entered and bowed. Your Majesty, Lord Chancellor Varius requests your presence in the council chamber immediately. Alaric's jaw tightened. Tell him I'll be there when I'm ready. The guard hesitated. Sire, he said to tell you that the council is voting, with or without you. What? Alaric's composure cracked. They can't hold a deposition vote without the king present. They're citing the Emergency Succession Act of 1247, which allows council action if the king is deemed temporarily unfit to... Alaric was already moving. He paused at the door and looked back at Lyra. Stay here. Lock the door. Let no one in except me or Clara. Do you understand? Alaric, promise me. She saw the fear in his eyes and nodded. I promise. He left at a run, the guard trailing behind him. Lyra locked the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering. This was it. The moment when everything either changed forever or collapsed completely, and she was locked in a storage room while the fate of the kingdom was decided without her. She lasted maybe 5 minutes before the inaction became unbearable. The streets had taught her that hiding only worked if no one was actively looking for you. Once you were the target, visibility could be a weapon. If the council was voting on whether Alaric was fit to rule, then they were really voting on whether his choice to defend her was insane or inspired, which meant she needed to be there. Lyra unlocked the door and slipped into the corridor. She knew the palace layout from her servant days, knew the hidden passages and servant stairs that let staff move unseen. She used them now, navigating by memory and instinct toward the council chamber. When she reached the gallery overlooking the chamber, she found it already packed with courtiers and nobles who'd been barred from the main floor. They pressed against the railing, straining to hear the proceedings below. Lyra wedged herself into a corner where she could see through a gap in the crowd. Below, the council sat in formal arrangement around their massive table. Alaric stood at one end, his face carved from stone. Lord Chancellor Varius held a scroll, reading from it in sonorous tones. And therefore, in accordance with the powers granted to this council under emergency provisions, we are compelled to question whether King Alaric Draven possesses the sound judgment necessary to rule this kingdom effectively. This is absurd, Alaric said, his voice tight with controlled fury. You're invoking emergency powers because I punished someone for committing fraud? We're invoking them, Lord Blackwood said, because you've demonstrated a pattern of erratic behavior, wandering the streets at night without protection, elevating a common servant to your household, publicly humiliating a member of your own family. These are not the actions of a stable leader. These are the actions, Alaric said coldly, of someone who's tired of watching this kingdom rot from the inside. But please continue. Let's see how far you're willing to go. Varius cleared his throat. We propose a vote of confidence. If a majority of this council votes that your judgment is sound, you retain full authority. If not, he paused significantly. Then we respectfully request that you step aside for a regency council until such time as you've recovered your balance. Recovered my balance. Alaric's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Fascinating euphemism for do what we tell you or we'll take the crown. At least be honest about the coup you're attempting. It's not a coup if it's legal, Lady Wessex said primly. Legal doesn't make it right, but I'm curious. Who gets to decide if I've recovered enough to rule again? This council? The same people who are so offended by the concept of justice that they're willing to depose a king over it? We're not offended by justice, Lord Blackwood said. We're concerned about stability. about the message you are sending to the common people, that they can challenge nobility, reject tradition, demand equality. Where does it end, Your Majesty? When every servant thinks they have the right to question their betters, when the entire social order collapses because you decided to make a point. If the social order can't survive basic fairness, Alaric said, then maybe it deserves to collapse. The room erupted in shouts, nobles on their feet, voices overlapping in rage and disbelief, various calling for order, and through it all, Alaric stood unmoved, a king alone against the tide. Lyra watched from the gallery and felt something crystallize inside her chest. This was her fault, not in the way the nobles meant, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because her existence had forced a choice, had made Alaric pick between justice and convenience, between principle and power. And now he was losing everything because he'd chosen her. She couldn't let that stand. Before she fully understood what she was doing, Lyra was moving, down from the gallery, through the corridors, toward the main entrance to the council chamber. Guards tried to stop her, but she was faster, fueled by the same desperate energy that had kept her alive on the streets. She burst through the chamber doors. Every head turned. The shouting died mid-word. Lyra walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. She stopped in the center of the room, directly between Alaric and the council table. "You want to know if the king is fit to rule?" she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "Then ask yourselves this. When was the last time any of you cared about whether something was right instead of whether it was convenient?" "Get her out of here," Lord Blackwood snarled. "No." Alaric's single word froze the guards who'd started forward. "Let her speak." Lyra turned to address the full council. "You're terrified because the king looked at a servant and saw a person, because he chose truth over tradition, because for one moment he put justice above your comfort. And that terrifies you because if he can do it for me, he might do it for anyone. Might start asking questions about whether all your power and privilege is actually deserved or just inherited." "This is beyond inappropriate," Lady Wessex began. "What's inappropriate," Lyra cut her off, "is that you're trying to remove a king for having a conscience. You call it instability. I call it courage. You call it poor judgment. I call it the only judgment that matters. The willingness to stand for something even when it costs you everything." She turned back to Alaric, and her next words were for him alone, though everyone could hear them. "But I won't let you lose your throne over me. I won't be the reason this kingdom falls into chaos." Understanding flashed in his eyes, followed immediately by denial. "Lyra, don't! I'm leaving," she announced, loud enough for the entire council to hear. "I'll take the compensation the king offered, and I'll go somewhere far from here. The justice has been done. Morgana confessed I was cleared. That's enough. The king doesn't need to lose everything just to prove a point." "No." Alaric's voice cut like a whip. "You're not leaving because they threaten me. That's not justice. That's just a different kind of surrender." "It's survival," Lyra said, "and I'm good at that. I don't want you to survive." The rawness in his voice made her chest ache. "I want you to live, to stay, to prove that this kingdom can be better than it's been." "Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Various said, his tone almost gentle, "the girl is being sensible. She leaves, the crisis ends, we all move forward. Surely that's the wise course." Alaric looked at Various, and his expression was colder than Lyra had ever seen it. "You think I don't see what you're doing? You're giving me a choice between her and the crown, betting I'll choose power. But here's what you don't understand. I'm not choosing her over the crown. I'm choosing the kingdom that deserves her over the kingdom that rejects her." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Alaric did something that would be talked about for generations. He removed his crown. The heavy circle of gold and gems caught the light as he held it up for everyone to see. Then he set it on the council table with a sound like thunder. "If the price of wearing this is pretending that justice only matters for nobles, then I don't want it. If ruling means I have to sacrifice the innocent to keep the powerful comfortable, then find someone else to do it. I'm done." The council chamber exploded into chaos, and Lyra, standing at the center of it all, watched a king choose truth over everything and realized with terrible clarity that she loved him for it, which made what she had to do next even harder. The crown sat on the council table like an accusation. Chaos erupted around it, nobles shouting, chairs scraping back, Lord Chancellor Various calling desperately for order that no one was interested in providing. But Lyra's eyes were locked on Alaric and his on her, and in that moment the rest of the world might as well have been a distant storm. "Pick it up," she said quietly, though her voice somehow cut through the noise. "Pick up the crown, Alaric." "I meant what I said. I know you did." She stepped closer, aware that every eye in the room was now fixed on them. "And that's exactly why you need to pick it up. Because a king who would give up his throne for principle is exactly the kind of king this kingdom needs." "They'll never accept you," he said. "We both know that." "Then make them." The words came out fiercer than she intended. "You think I survived 3 weeks on the streets by hoping people would be kind? I survived by refusing to disappear, by making them see me whether they wanted to or not." She turned to face the council, her voice rising. "You want me gone because I make you uncomfortable, because my existence forces you to acknowledge that your system is broken. But here's the thing about broken systems. They only stay broken as long as everyone pretends they're working fine." Lord Blackwood found his voice first. "This is absurd. The girl has no standing to address this council." "The girl," Lyra interrupted, "is the reason you're all here. So yes, I think I've earned the right to speak." She looked around the room, meeting eyes that wanted to look away but couldn't. "You keep calling the king unstable, questioning his judgment, but the only thing he's done is refuse to let an innocent person be destroyed for someone else's jealousy. If that's instability, then what does it say about all of you that you think it's wrong?" "It's not about right or wrong," Lady Wessex said, her voice sharp. "It's about order, about maintaining the structures that keep this kingdom functioning." "Functioning for who?" Lyra demanded. "Because it wasn't functioning for me when I was starving in an alley. It wasn't functioning for Granny Silt when she died on the street and no one cared. Your order works great for people who are already comfortable, but it's built on the backs of everyone else." "So what do you propose?" Lord Chancellor Various asked, and there was something almost genuine in his curiosity. "That we simply abolish all social hierarchy? That every servant should be treated as an equal to nobility?" "I propose," Lyra said carefully, "that you start treating people like they matter regardless of their birth. That's not abolishing hierarchy, it's just basic human decency." "Pretty words," Lord Blackwood sneered. "But words don't feed kingdoms. Words don't maintain armies or negotiate treaties or keep the peace between noble houses. The king needs our support to rule effectively. Without us, he's just a man with a crown. With us, he's the foundation of stability. And we're telling him that his current path is unsustainable." "Because you're afraid," Alaric said quietly. He hadn't moved from where he stood, but his voice carried absolute authority. "You're afraid that if I can choose justice for her, I might choose it for anyone. Might start questioning the taxes you levy on your lands, the way you treat your own people, the comfortable arrangements you've built with each other over decades. You're not worried about stability, you're worried about accountability." The truth of it landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through the assembled nobles. "Your Majesty," Various said, his tone shifting to something more negotiable, "perhaps we can reach a compromise. The girl receives her vindication and compensation, as you've demanded. Lady Morgana faces her exile. Justice is served. But Miss Vance leaves the palace quietly, and we all move forward without this divisiveness." "Why?" Lyra asked before Alaric could respond. "Why do I have to leave? What crime have I committed except surviving what you people did to me?" "You haven't committed a crime," Various said with strained patience. "But your continued presence is creating instability. Then the instability is your problem, not mine." Lyra felt something shift inside her, the same clarity she'd felt on the streets when she'd realized the only way out was through. "You want me gone because I'm proof that your system failed. Because every time you look at me, you have to remember that you almost killed someone for a crime they didn't commit. And that's uncomfortable for you. Well, good. Stay uncomfortable. Maybe it'll motivate you to be better." "Insolent girl," Lady Wessex was on her feet. "How dare you lecture us about compassion, about fairness, about giving a damn whether innocent people suffer?" Lyra's voice rose to match hers. "Yeah, how dare I? Much better to just accept that nobles can do whatever they want, and servants should be grateful for whatever scraps fall from your table." "This is exactly what we're talking about," Lord Blackwood said, gesturing at Lyra like she was evidence in a trial. The girl has no respect for authority, no understanding of proper order. She speaks to us like we're equals when any trained servant knows, I'm not a trained servant anymore, Lyra cut him off. I'm someone who survived your cruelty and came back stronger. And if that threatens you, then maybe you should ask yourself why. The chamber had gone silent again, that peculiar quiet that comes when people are forced to confront truths they'd rather ignore. Into that silence, a new voice spoke from the back of the room. She's right. Everyone turned. A young nobleman in military dress stood near the door. Lyra didn't recognize him, but from the sharp intake of breath around the room, clearly others did. Lord Theron, Various said carefully, this is a closed council session. I served 3 years on the northern border, Lord Theron continued, walking forward into the chamber. I watched soldiers die protecting this kingdom, common-born men with no titles or lands, fighting because they believed the crown cared about them, about justice, about something more than just keeping nobles comfortable. He stopped near the council table. And now I'm watching you try to remove a king because he actually proved those soldiers right, because he chose principle over politics. If that's the problem, then the problem isn't the king. Lord Theron, your service is appreciated, Lord Blackwood began, but you're young and perhaps don't understand the complexities. I understand that we almost killed an innocent woman, and you're angry that the king cares. Theron's voice was hard. I understand that you're calling courage instability and principle poor judgment, and I understand that if you remove King Alaric for this, you'll be proving that the crown only serves the nobility, which means the rest of us are just tools for your convenience. Other voices began to rise, younger nobles, military officers, even a few older lords who'd been quiet until now. Not many, but enough to create visible fractures in what had seemed like a unified opposition. The boy has a point, a grizzled lord near the end of the table said. Never sat right with me how quickly we threw the girl out. No trial, no questions, just convenient. Lord Harrow, surely you're not suggesting— I'm suggesting we think hard about what we're doing here, Harrow interrupted. My father taught me that nobility comes with responsibility, that our privilege is earned by serving the kingdom, not just ourselves. Seems to me the king's the only one in this room remembering that. The momentum was shifting. Lyra could feel it, the way she'd learned to feel the mood of the streets. When danger was building or dissipating, when a crowd was about to turn violent or scatter. Various sensed it too. His expression hardened. Stirring speeches aside, we still have a fundamental question before us. Does this council have confidence in King Alaric's judgment, or do we invoke emergency measures for the stability of the realm? Call the vote then, Alaric said. He still hadn't picked up the crown. Let's see where everyone stands when forced to choose in the open instead of whispering in corridors. Very well, Various straightened. All those in favor of invoking emergency measures and establishing a regency council. Wait! Lyra stepped forward before she could stop herself. Before you vote, I want to make something very clear. Miss Vance, you have no authority to— I have the authority of someone you almost murdered, she said flatly. So you're going to listen. She looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as she could. If you vote to remove the king, you're not just making a political choice. You're declaring that justice only matters when it's convenient, that nobles can destroy common people without consequences, that the crown serves you instead of the kingdom. She paused. And if that's the kingdom you want, then I'll leave. I'll take the money and go. But I'll make sure everyone knows why. Every soldier, every servant, every person who isn't noble-born, they'll know that when the king tried to stand for them, you removed him for it. Is that a threat? Lady Wessex demanded. It's a promise, Lyra said. Truth has a way of spreading. You can try to control it, suppress it, pretend it doesn't matter. But people talk. And when word gets out that you deposed a king for choosing justice over politics. She shrugged. Well, I guess we'll see how stable your kingdom really is. Lord Blackwood's face went red. You dare threaten this council? I'm not threatening anyone, Lyra said calmly. I'm just pointing out consequences. You taught me about those, remember? When you threw me out to starve. I learned a lot on those streets, including how to survive by making sure truth gets heard, whether powerful people want it to or not. The silence that followed was different than before. Heavier, more thoughtful, Lord Chancellor Varius studied her with new intensity. You've changed from the quiet servant girl who served wine at the selection. 3 weeks of starvation will do that, Lyra said. Turns out when you've got nothing left to lose, fear stops working as a weapon. Then what does work? Varius asked, and he seemed genuinely curious. Truth, courage, basic human decency. She gestured to Alaric. Things the king was trying to demonstrate before you all decided it was too uncomfortable. Your Majesty, Varius said after a long moment, perhaps we were hasty. The situation has been emotional, and emotions cloud judgment on all sides. Is that an apology? Alaric asked coldly. It's an acknowledgement that this matter requires more careful consideration than a rushed vote. Varius looked around the table. I propose we table the emergency measures and instead focus on practical questions. How Miss Vance's position in the household would work. What precedents we're setting. How to frame this to the kingdom at large. In other words, Lord Blackwood said bitterly, you're capitulating. I'm choosing to think strategically instead of reactively, Varius said. The girl made valid points about perception and consequences. If we move against the king and it becomes public that we did so over a matter of simple justice. He shook his head. That's not a fight I want to have with every common-born soldier and servant in the realm. So we just accept this farce? Lady Wessex's voice was shrill. Accept that a servant can address us as equals, that tradition means nothing. That we accept, Lord Theron interrupted, that the world is changing whether we like it or not. My soldiers talk about fairness and rights. The merchants are organizing guilds with real power. The common people are learning to read and question and demand better. We can adapt to that reality or be swept away by it. But we can't pretend it's not happening. The pragmatism in his voice seemed to penetrate where emotion hadn't. Lyra watched several nobles exchange glances, silent calculations happening behind their eyes. Finally, Lord Harrow spoke. I vote to maintain the king's full authority. The girl was wronged, justice was served, and I'm not removing a monarch for having a conscience. As do I, Theron added immediately. One by one, other voices joined, not many, but enough, and with each declaration, Lyra watched the opposition crumble, not from defeat, but from pragmatic reassessment. When Varius finally counted the votes, the result was narrow but clear. The emergency measures were rejected. Alaric remained motionless for a long moment. Then he reached out and picked up the crown, but he didn't immediately put it back on. Instead, he held it up, letting light catch the gems and gold. This doesn't belong on my head, he said quietly. It belongs to the kingdom, to every person in it, noble and common alike. And I swear now before all of you that I will never forget that again. He placed the crown back on his head. We serve the kingdom, not the other way around. And if you can't accept that truth, then we're going to have this fight again and again until you do. Lord Blackwood stood and stormed from the chamber, several other nobles following. But more stayed than left, and the ones who remained wore expressions ranging from thoughtful to resigned to cautiously approving. Varius cleared his throat. Then let us discuss practical matters. Miss Vance, you're assigned to the king's personal household. What exactly will your duties entail? Lyra looked at Alaric, suddenly uncertain. They'd fought so hard for the principle that they hadn't actually planned the details. She'll serve as my personal liaison to the common people, Alaric said, the answer coming to him as he spoke. Someone who understands life outside the palace walls, who can tell me when policies hurt instead of help, who can remind me in this council what the kingdom looks like from the bottom instead of the top. That's not a traditional position, Lady Wessex said, though her opposition sounded more tired than angry now. Then we'll create a tradition, Alaric said, starting now. The council session dragged on for hours after that, hammering out details and protocols and face-saving measures for nobles who needed a way to accept the new reality without admitting they'd been wrong. Lyra sat through it all, occasionally answering questions, but mostly watching the machinery of power adapt to accommodate something it had tried to reject. When it finally ended and the nobles filed out in small clusters of conversation and calculation, only Lyra and Alaric remained in the chamber. You should have left when I gave you the chance, he said after a long silence. Probably, she agreed, but I'm not very good at doing what I should. No. A smile tugged at his mouth. You're not. She stood and walked to where he still sat at the head of the table, the crown slightly askew on his head from hours of council debate. Without thinking about protocol or propriety, she reached up and straightened it. This suits you, she said, but only because you were willing to give it up for something that mattered. His hand came up to cover hers, holding it against the crown for a moment. I didn't know if you'd stay. When I put this down, I thought maybe you'd see it as the excuse to leave that I wouldn't give you. I thought about it, Lyra admitted, for maybe half a second, but then I realized that running would mean they won, would mean everything I survived on the streets was for nothing. So I stayed. I'm glad. His voice was rough. I'm glad you stayed, and I'm terrified of what it means, and I have no idea how we move forward from here. One day at a time, Lyra said, echoing the philosophy that had kept her alive when survival seemed impossible. We wake up tomorrow and face whatever comes, same as we did today. Today we almost lost everything, but we didn't. She stepped back, letting her hand fall away from his. We're still here, still standing. That's more than I had 3 weeks ago. A servant appeared at the door, Clara, her expression somewhere between shock and delight. Your Majesty, Miss Vance, the palace is buzzing. Everyone's talking about what happened in the council, the servants especially. Let me guess, Alaric said dryly. Half think I've lost my mind, the other half think Lyra's bewitched me somehow. Actually, Claire said with a small smile, most of the servants are saying it's about time someone stood up to the nobles. One of the kitchen staff started crying when she heard you wouldn't back down, said it was the first time in her 30 years here that she felt like the crown actually saw people like her. The words landed in the quiet chamber like stones in still water. Lyra felt something catch in her throat, the weight of what they'd actually accomplished hitting her all at once. We changed something, she said softly. Didn't we? Not everything, not even most things, but something. The beginning of something, Alaric agreed, which might be more dangerous than changing nothing at all. Over the following days, the palace transformed around them. Not in any dramatic way, but in small shifts that accumulated like snow building toward an avalanche. Servants who'd previously kept their eyes down when passing Lyra in the corridors now nodded respectfully. A few even smiled. The kitchen staff sent up extra food to her quarters without being asked, and Clara reported that the servants' hall was abuzz with excited speculation about what other changes might be coming. But the nobles were a different matter entirely. Lord Blackwood and his allies had retreated into cold fury, making their displeasure known through pointed absences and calculated slights. Lady Wessex organized a tea gathering that invited every noble lady in the palace except Lyra, a calculated insult that everyone understood perfectly. And through it all, Morgana remained in her quarters awaiting her exile, a ghost haunting the edges of palace life. 3 days after the council session, Lyra found herself summoned to Alaric's private study. She arrived to find him staring at a map of the kingdom, his expression troubled. Lord Blackwood is calling a gathering of northern nobles, he said without preamble. Officially, it's to discuss trade routes. Unofficially, it's to organize opposition to what they're calling my radical reforms. I'm hardly a reform, Lyra said. I'm one person. You're a symbol, and symbols matter. He turned to face her. They're going to push back harder than this. Test boundaries, look for weaknesses, and they'll come after you first because you're the visible proof that I meant what I said. Let them come. Lyra was surprised by her own certainty. I survived worse than political scheming. Have you? Alaric moved closer. On the streets, the threat was straightforward. Hunger, cold, violence. Here, the threat comes wrapped in silk and smiles. They'll destroy you so subtly you won't even see it happening until it's done. Then I'll have to learn to see it. She met his eyes. You think I didn't notice on the streets? How people would smile while they stole from you? How kindness was often just a prelude to cruelty? The palace isn't that different, just better dressed. A knock interrupted them. Clara entered, her expression urgent. Your Majesty, Miss Vance, Lady Morgana is asking to see both of you before she leaves for her exile. She says it's important. Lyra and Alaric exchanged glances. Could be a trap, he said. Probably is, Lyra agreed. Let's go anyway. They found Morgana in her chambers, surrounded by packed trunks and the stripped bare elegance of a life being dismantled. She stood by the window, her profile perfect even in defeat. "Thank you for coming," she said without turning. "I wasn't certain you would." "Make it quick," Alaric said coldly. "Your carriage leaves within the hour." Morgana turned then, and Lyra was startled to see genuine tears on her face. Not the calculated performance from before, but something rawer. "I wanted to apologize," Morgana said, looking directly at Lyra. "Not because I have to, or because it helps me, but because what I did to you was monstrous, and you deserved better." Lyra studied her carefully, looking for the manipulation beneath the words. But all she saw was a woman who'd gambled everything on jealousy and lost. "Why?" Lyra asked. "Why frame me? Why not just ignore me? I was nothing to you." "Because you weren't nothing to him." Morgana's voice broke slightly. "I've loved Alaric since we were children, watched him grow into this brilliant, lonely man who seemed to see through everyone except me. And then at the selection, he looked at you, really looked. And I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen when he looked at me. Connection. Recognition. Like you understood something about him that no one else could see. So you tried to destroy her," Alaric said flatly. "I tried to make her disappear," Morgana corrected. "I thought if she was gone, you'd forget. Move on. Maybe finally see me the way you saw her." She laughed bitterly. "Instead, I gave you a cause, turned her into exactly the kind of person you'd defend to the death. My jealousy created the very thing I was trying to prevent." The admission hung in the air like smoke. "I don't forgive you," Lyra said quietly. "You had me thrown into hell for 3 weeks, watched me almost die. I can't forgive that." "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Morgana said, "but I hope someday you can at least understand why. Love makes us do terrible things sometimes, especially when we think we're losing the only thing that matters." She turned to Alaric. "Take care of her. She's stronger than she looks. But the nobles will come for her in ways she can't anticipate. They'll smile and scheme and slowly poison everything good about what you're trying to build. Don't let them." "I won't," Alaric said. "And Lyra?" Morgana's voice softened. "You won. Not just the battle, but the war I didn't even know we were fighting. He looks at you like you're air and water and everything necessary. Guard that carefully. It's rarer than crowns." Before Lyra could respond, Morgana gathered her cloak and walked toward the door. She paused at the threshold and looked back one last time. "For what it's worth, I think you'll be good for him. Better than I ever could have been. And I think maybe the kingdom needs someone like you, someone who remembers what it's like to have nothing and fight for everything." Her smile was sad. "I just wish I'd been big enough to see that before I tried to destroy you for it." Then she was gone, leaving only silence and the ghost of regrets behind. Lyra and Alaric stood in the empty chamber, surrounded by the remnants of Morgana's life. "Do you believe her?" Alaric asked. "The apology?" "I think she meant it," Lyra said slowly. "But meaning it doesn't undo what she did. Doesn't give me back those 3 weeks. Doesn't erase watching Granny Silt die or the cold or the hunger or any of it." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They walked back through the palace together, and Lyra noticed something had shifted. The servants they passed didn't just nod anymore. They smiled. A few even dipped quick curtsies that seemed genuine rather than obligatory. In the great hall, a group of young nobles were gathered, and Lyra tensed automatically, but instead of sneers or hostile glares, she received nods. Cautious. Still uncertain, but no longer openly hostile. "They're adapting," Alaric observed. "The pragmatic ones, at least. They see which way the wind is blowing, and they're adjusting their positions accordingly." "Is that enough?" Lyra asked. "People changing because it's convenient rather than because they believe it's right?" "It's a start." He glanced at her. "You don't change hearts overnight, but you can change behavior, and sometimes the hearts follow." That night, Lyra stood again at her window, now repaired, the broken glass replaced, and looked out over the city. Somewhere down there were the alleys she'd hidden in, the people still fighting to survive, the invisible population that the palace preferred not to acknowledge. But things were changing, slowly, subtly, but genuinely. The servants spoke more freely. The younger nobles were questioning traditions they'd previously accepted without thought. And at the center of it all, a king who'd been willing to give up his crown rather than compromise his principles. Clara appeared at her door with evening tea. "Miss Vance? There's someone here to see you. Says his name is Marcus." Lyra's heart jumped. Marcus from the streets, the former soldier who'd been scavenging bins the night Granny Silt died. She found him in the small receiving room, looking uncomfortable in the palace surroundings but standing straight despite his missing leg. When he saw her, something like relief crossed his weathered face. "You made it," he said simply. "Heard rumors that the palace took back the girl they'd thrown out. Wanted to see if it was true." "It's true," Lyra said. "How did you get in here?" "Told the guards I had information for you. They almost threw me out, but then one of them, older fellow, looked like he'd seen some things, said anyone who survived the streets deserved a chance to speak their piece." Marcus smiled crookedly. "World's changing when palace guards start thinking like that." "It is," Lyra agreed. "Marcus, I have access to resources now. If you need help—" He held up a hand. "Didn't come begging, girl. Came to tell you something. After you left that night, after Granny Silt died, I started watching, seeing how the city treats people like us. And I realized something. You were right to fight, to come back here and make them see you." He met her eyes. "You're doing more than surviving now. You're proving that the bottom doesn't have to stay the bottom. That's worth something." "I'm just one person," Lyra said. "So was Granny Silt. So am I. So is every person on those streets. But when one of us stands up and refuses to disappear, it makes the rest of us remember we're human too." He nodded toward the door. "I should go. Just wanted you to know there's people out there watching what you're doing, hoping you succeed. Because if you can go from the streets to standing in front of kings and councils, maybe the rest of us aren't as powerless as they want us to believe." After Marcus left, Lyra found Alaric in his study, reviewing reports by candlelight. She told him about the visit, about Marcus's words. "You're becoming more than a symbol," Alaric said thoughtfully. "You're becoming hope, for everyone who's ever been told they don't matter because of where they were born." "That's terrifying," Lyra admitted. "Yes," he agreed, "but it's also necessary, and you're strong enough to carry it." She crossed to where he sat and did something she'd been wanting to do since the council chamber. She took his hand. "We're carrying it together," she said firmly. "You and me, king and former servant. Working to prove that the kingdom can be better than it's been." His fingers tightened around hers. "Together," he echoed. And in that moment, surrounded by maps and reports and the weight of a kingdom in transition, Lyra felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since before her fall. Not just hope, purpose. The battle wasn't over. The nobles would continue to push back, the traditions would resist change, and the path forward remained uncertain and dangerous. But for the first time since being thrown from the palace gates, Lyra wasn't just surviving. She was building something that mattered, and that was worth fighting for. The seasons changed, and with them, the kingdom. Winter arrived early that year, coating Thornhaven in snow that transformed the capital into something almost beautiful. But the real transformation was happening inside the palace walls, in council chambers and servants' halls, in whispered conversations and bold declarations that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. Lyra stood in what had become her office, a small room near the king's study, filled with letters and reports from across the kingdom. Messages from servants reporting abuses, soldiers asking for better conditions, merchants requesting fair trade agreements. Every day brought more, a flood of voices that had been silent for generations finally finding the courage to speak. "You can't answer all of them personally," Clara said, sorting through the latest delivery. "There are too many." "I know." Lyra studied a letter from a village in the western provinces where a local lord had been withholding grain shipments to punish tenants who'd complained about conditions. But each one matters. Each person who wrote believes someone might actually listen. I can't ignore that. "Then hire staff. Build a department. You're one person, Lyra. Even you have limits." It was true. The past months had been a blur of work that never quite ended. Reviewing cases, advising Alaric on common perspectives, attending council sessions where she still drew hostile stares from certain nobles. The pragmatists had adapted, but the traditionalists fought her presence at every turn. And through it all, something had been building between her and Alaric that neither fully acknowledged, but everyone could see. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A guard entered and bowed. "Miss Vance, the king requests your presence in the throne room. Immediately. He says it's urgent." The throne room was packed when she arrived. Nobles, council members, military officers, even servants lining the walls. Whatever this was, it was meant to be witnessed. Alaric stood before his throne, his expression unreadable. Lord Chancellor Varius stood to his right, looking troubled. To his left was Lord Theron, whose support had been unwavering since the council vote. "Thank you for coming," Alaric said as Lyra approached. His formality sent a spike of worry through her chest. "I've called this assembly to address a matter that has been building for months, a question that the kingdom needs answered." He descended the dais steps until he stood level with her, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Lyra Vance, you have served this kingdom with distinction since your vindication. You have brought voice to the voiceless, challenged injustice wherever you found it, and reminded us all what it means to serve something larger than ourselves." He paused. "But your position remains unofficial, undefined, a stopgap measure that satisfied no one fully." Lyra's throat tightened. This sounded like a dismissal wrapped in praise. "So I have consulted with the council," Alaric continued, "and we have created a new position within the royal household, the Office of Common Advocacy, with full authority to investigate grievances, recommend policy changes, and represent the interests of non-noble citizens directly to the throne." He met her eyes. "I can think of no one better suited to lead this office than you." Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. "However," Lord Chancellor Varius stepped forward, "there is a complication. The council has agreed to this office on one condition: that its leader possess the legal standing to address the court as an equal, which means—" He took a breath. "Miss Vance would need to be granted noble status." The room erupted in whispers. Lyra felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "You want to make me a noble?" "It's the only way to satisfy the traditionalists," Varius explained. "They cannot accept a common-born person wielding official authority in court. But if you hold title, even a minor one, the precedent holds." "Which defeats the entire purpose," Lyra said, anger rising in her voice. "The whole point is that common people deserve representation regardless of title. Making me a noble just proves their point, that you have to become one of them to matter." "I know," Alaric said quietly, "which is why I'm giving you the choice. Accept the title and the position, with all the power to create real change that comes with it. Or refuse, maintain your common status, and we find another way forward, though I admit I don't know what that way looks like yet." Lyra looked around the room. She saw nobles watching with expressions ranging from hopeful to hostile. She saw servants pressed against the walls, their faces showing a different kind of hope, the desperate wish that she'd find a way to bridge the impossible gap. And she saw the trap. If she accepted the title, she became proof that the system worked, that anyone could rise if they were exceptional enough. Never mind that she was exceptional because circumstances had forced her to be. Never mind that thousands of others had died in the same situations that had merely hardened her. But if she refused, she lost the power to help those thousands, lost the authority to investigate abuses, to push for change, to be more than a symbol. "Can I have time to think about this?" she asked. "Of course," Alaric said. "Though I should mention, Lord Blackwood has called for a formal challenge to your position. He's demanding a public debate before the full court. Tomorrow. He's claiming that your continued presence undermines the kingdom's stability and that you've overstepped your authority." His expression darkened. "He's making this personal, Lyra. He wants to humiliate you publicly, force you out through shame if he can't do it through policy." "Then let him try," Lyra said, her voice harder than she felt. "I've faced worse than Lord Blackwood's wounded pride." "Have you?" Alaric asked. "Because this won't be street violence or hunger. This will be him using every rhetorical weapon he's sharpened over 40 years of politics. He'll twist your words, make your survival sound like manipulation, paint you as an ambitious commoner who seduced a naive king, and he'll do it in front of the entire court, where appearances matter more than truth." "Good," Lyra said, surprising herself. "Then maybe it's time someone challenged him in the open instead of whispering behind closed doors. You want a debate? Fine. Let's have one. Let's put every assumption and prejudice on display and see which arguments actually hold up to scrutiny." Theron stepped forward. Your Majesty, perhaps I should mention Lord Blackwood has been gathering support. He's framed this as a referendum on the direction of the kingdom. If he wins the debate, if he sways enough nobles, we could be looking at another vote of confidence. A real one this time, with more preparation and coordination. So my throne is at stake again, Alaric said, because I chose to give a damn about justice. Not just your throne, Various said quietly. The entire reform movement. Everything we've built these past months, the advocacy office, the new policies, the shift in how we govern. Lord Blackwood sees this as his chance to roll it all back, return to the comfortable old ways where nobles never had to question their privilege. Lyra felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. Not just her own fate, but the hopes of everyone who'd written those letters. Everyone still struggling on the streets, everyone who'd dared to believe that maybe the kingdom could be better. When tomorrow comes, she said, I'll be ready. That night, she couldn't sleep. She stood at her window and watched snow fall over the city, thinking about choices and consequences and the girl she'd been 6 months ago. That girl would have been terrified, would have run rather than face public humiliation, would have taken the easy path of accepting the title and letting herself be absorbed into the system that had nearly killed her. But that girl had died in the alleys. The woman who'd emerged was harder, clearer, forged in hunger and cold into something that refused to break. A soft knock at her door. She turned to find Alaric there, still dressed despite the late hour. Can't sleep either? He asked. Too much thinking. He crossed to stand beside her at the window. For a long moment they just looked out at the falling snow, comfortable in the silence between them. You don't have to do this, he said finally. The debate. We could find another way. What other way? Let Blackwood win by default? Prove him right that I can't defend my own existence? You shouldn't have to defend your existence. That's the entire problem. But I do, Lyra said. Because the world we want doesn't exist yet. We have to build it, piece by piece, argument by argument. And sometimes that means standing in front of people who hate you and refusing to back down until they're forced to see you as human. Alaric turned to face her fully. I'm afraid for you. Tomorrow will be brutal. I know. She met his eyes. But I'm more afraid of what happens if I don't fight. If I let fear win and run away, because then everything you risked, everything we've built, collapses. And all those people who wrote those letters go back to believing that nothing ever changes, that power always wins, that there's no point in hoping for better. You carry too much, he said softly. So do you. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheek with a gentleness that made her throat ache. Lyra, I need to tell you something. Before tomorrow, before everything else, in case I don't get another chance. Don't, she whispered. Don't say goodbye. Not yet. I'm not saying goodbye. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. I'm saying that somewhere between finding you in that alley and watching you stand up to the entire council, I fell in love with you, completely, irrevocably, in ways that terrify me because I'm a king and you're a former servant who survived hell, she finished. I know who I am, Alaric, and I know who you are. And I think maybe we understand each other better than we understand anyone else. Is that love, he asked, or just shared trauma and mutual stubbornness? She laughed despite the tears burning behind her eyes. Can it be both? He kissed her then, soft and careful and full of everything they hadn't been able to say. And for that moment, the weight of tomorrow didn't matter. The throne and the council and Lord Blackwood's schemes faded to nothing. There was just this. Just them. Just the truth they'd both been dancing around for months. When they finally pulled apart, Alaric rested his forehead against hers again. Tomorrow, whatever happens, we face it together. Together, she echoed, king and commoner, proving the impossible. You're not common, he said. You never were. Everyone's common until circumstances force them to be extraordinary, Lyra said. That's what Blackwood doesn't understand. Nobility isn't born, it's forged. And I was forged in places that would have broken most of his precious aristocrats. Then show them that tomorrow. Show them what real strength looks like. The throne room had been transformed into a debate hall. Rows of seats faced a central platform where Lyra and Lord Blackwood would present their arguments. Every noble within the capital had crowded in, along with military officers, wealthy merchants, and, in a decision that had caused its own scandal, a section reserved for common citizens. Servants, soldiers, craftspeople who'd been granted the unprecedented right to witness the proceedings. Lord Blackwood stood on his side of the platform, resplendent in burgundy robes that proclaimed his status and wealth. He looked confident, comfortable, a man in his natural element. Lyra wore the simple blue dress she'd been given after her vindication. No jewels, no elaborate styling, just herself, as she'd been from the start. Alaric sat on his throne, but he'd positioned it to the side rather than above, a symbolic gesture that he was witnessing, not judging. Lord Chancellor Various stepped forward to lay out the rules. Each speaker would present their case, then questions from the assembled nobles. Finally, a discussion among the council about the path forward. "Lord Blackwood," Various said, "you called for this debate. You may begin." Blackwood inclined his head graciously and turned to address the room. His voice carried perfect authority, each word calculated for maximum impact. "My friends, we stand at a crossroads. 6 months ago, this court made a decision, some would say a mistake, to allow sentiment to override centuries of wisdom. We permitted a common servant, accused of theft and rightly expelled, to return to the palace based on the word of a king who admits he makes decisions based on emotion rather than reason." "That's not what happened," Lyra started, but Various raised a hand. "You'll have your turn, Miss Vance," Blackwood continued. "Since then, we have watched the natural order of our kingdom erode. Servants speak boldly to their betters. Common folk send letters demanding changes to policies they don't understand. The very foundations of stability, respect for hierarchy, acceptance of one's station, deference to those born to lead, have been undermined by the elevation of a single girl who represents everything our system is designed to prevent." He turned to look directly at Lyra. "Miss Vance, I bear you no personal ill will. By all accounts, you survived a difficult situation with remarkable resilience. But your survival does not qualify you to reshape a kingdom. Your suffering does not grant you wisdom. And your relationship with the king, whatever its nature, does not entitle you to authority over people whose families have served this realm for generations." The room erupted in murmurs. Blackwood had directly referenced the rumored romance, making it part of the official record. "I propose," Blackwood said, raising his voice over the noise, "that we acknowledge the experiment has failed, that we thank Miss Vance for her service, provide her with generous compensation, and return to governing the kingdom according to principles proven over centuries rather than the emotional impulses of a young king and his favorite." He sat down to scattered applause from the traditionalist nobles. Various looked at Lyra. "Miss Vance, your response." Lyra stood and walked to the center of the platform, every eye in the room fixed on her. In the common section, she saw faces she recognized: Clara, Marcus on his crutch, other servants and soldiers who'd found the courage to attend. She took a breath and began. "Lord Blackwood speaks of natural order and centuries of wisdom. So let me ask a question. If your system is so wise, so natural, so proven, why did it nearly kill me for a crime I didn't commit?" The directness of it silenced the murmurs. "You talk about stability and hierarchy as if they're sacred. But here's what I learned on the streets where your stability threw me. Your system only works for people it's designed to work for. Everyone else just survives in the cracks, hoping nobles like you don't notice them long enough to crush them." "Miss Vance?" Blackwood interrupted. "Emotional appeals do not constitute—" "I'm not making an emotional appeal," Lyra cut him off. "I'm pointing out a fact. Your wisdom, your centuries of tradition, your natural order, it condemned an innocent woman to death by starvation and didn't lose a single night's sleep over it. If that's the best your system can do, then maybe it's time for a new system." "So you admit it," Blackwood pounced. "You seek to overthrow the established order." "I seek to improve it," Lyra corrected. "There's a difference. I'm not trying to make servants into nobles or nobles into servants. I'm trying to make everyone remember that regardless of birth or title, we're all human. We all deserve basic fairness. And when the system fails that test, when it protects the guilty and punishes the innocent, because that's more convenient than seeking truth, then the system needs to change." She turned to address the full room. "Lord Blackwood says I don't understand policy, that my suffering doesn't grant me wisdom. But I've spent the last 6 months reading every report, every petition, every complaint that comes to the Office of Common Advocacy. And you know what I've learned? The problems facing this kingdom aren't complex. They're simple. Nobles abuse power because they can. Common people suffer because they're told that's their lot. And everyone pretends this is natural when it's really just comfortable for the people on top. You oversimplify, Blackwood began. Do I? Lyra's voice rose. A village in the west is starving because their lord withholds grain to punish them for complaining about conditions. Is that complex or is it just cruel? Soldiers who fought for this kingdom are begging on the streets because there's no system to help them after they're wounded. Is that wisdom or is it just neglect? Servants work 16-hour days for wages that barely cover food, and when they dare to ask for better, they're told to be grateful for what they have. Is that natural or is it just exploitation? The room had gone absolutely silent. I'm not trying to destroy your system, Lord Blackwood. I'm trying to save it, because right now it's rotting from the inside. And every day that we pretend everything is fine, more people suffer, more people die. More people learn that the crown doesn't care about them unless they're born with the right name. And you believe you're the solution? Blackwood's voice dripped with scorn. A former servant with 6 months of experience thinks she can fix problems that have existed for centuries? No, Lyra said. I think the solution is the king actually listening to the people he governs instead of just the nobles who want to preserve their privilege. I think the solution is creating systems where justice matters regardless of who needs it. I think the solution is remembering that ruling a kingdom means serving everyone in it, not just the comfortable few. Idealistic nonsense, Blackwood said. Pretty words that ignore the realities of governance. Then explain those realities to me, Lyra challenged. Explain why fairness is impossible, why we can't investigate abuses of power, why common people don't deserve basic protections. Explain it in a way that doesn't just amount to because we've always done it this way. Blackwood opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he looked uncertain. You can't, can you? Lyra pressed. Because the only reason your system works the way it does is that it benefits you. And you're so used to that benefit that you've convinced yourself it's natural. That people like me are supposed to serve people like you without question, without complaint, without expecting anything in return except the privilege of not starving. That is not... Blackwood's composure was cracking. It is exactly that, Lyra said. And the only reason you're fighting so hard to remove me is because my existence proves that your assumptions are wrong. That common people aren't lesser. That nobility isn't inherent. That the only real difference between us is luck and circumstances. She walked closer to where Blackwood stood. I should have died in those alleys. By every measure of your natural order, I should be forgotten by now. A cautionary tale whispered by servants. A footnote in someone's guilt, if anyone bothered to feel guilty at all. But I didn't die. I survived. And I came back. And now I'm standing here proving that your system isn't inevitable, it's just powerful. And power without justice is just tyranny with better clothes. The silence in the room was complete. Then, from the commons section, someone started clapping. Clara, her hands coming together in defiant applause. Others joined her, servants, soldiers, common citizens who'd never expected to witness nobility being challenged so directly. The nobles looked shocked. This wasn't done. Commoners didn't applaud in the throne room, they didn't react at all, but the applause spread, growing louder, until even some of the younger nobles joined in. Not many, but enough to show that something fundamental had shifted. Lord Blackwood stood frozen, his face red with humiliation and rage. Your Majesty, he said, turning to Alaric, surely you won't allow this mockery. I'll allow truth, Alaric said, standing from his throne, which is what we just witnessed. Miss Vance, thank you for your candor. He addressed the full room. The council will deliberate on the proposals before us, but I want to be clear about my position. The Office of Common Advocacy will continue. The reforms will continue. And anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to challenge me directly, rather than attacking the woman I've chosen to help me govern justly. Chosen to help you govern? Lady Wessex stood, her voice sharp. Your Majesty, surely you're not suggesting... I'm stating a fact, Alaric said. Lyra Vance has proven herself more capable than half this council. She understands the kingdom in ways none of you do because she's lived in the parts of it you pretend don't exist. And I value that perspective. He paused. which is why I'm appointing her as my chief advisor on domestic policy, with full authority to attend all council sessions and represent the interests of common citizens. The room erupted again, but this time Alaric didn't wait for order. He descended from the dais and took Lyra's hand, a gesture so publicly intimate that it silenced the crowd more effectively than any command. "And since we're being honest," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned room, "I should mention that I intend to ask Miss Vance to marry me. Not immediately, we both have work to do first, but eventually. Because I've learned that the right partner isn't someone who shares your station, it's someone who shares your values. And I've found that in her." The silence was so complete that Lyra could hear her own heartbeat. Then Lord Theron stood. "Your Majesty, as much as I support reform, marriage to a commoner would require council approval under the Marriage Act of 1186, Alaric finished. "I know, and when the time comes, I'll ask for that approval. But I'm not asking for permission to value her, respect her, or love her. Those are my choices to make." He turned to Lyra, and his expression softened. "I probably should have asked you first before announcing my intentions to the entire court. Sorry about that." Despite everything, the tension, the political implications, the hundreds of watching eyes, Lyra laughed. "You really don't do anything the conventional way, do you?" "Not if I can help it." He squeezed her hand. "What do you say? Want to help me finish remaking this kingdom? Then marry me and we'll make it official?" "That's possibly the least romantic proposal in history," Lyra said. "It's also the most honest." She looked out at the room, at the nobles who would fight them every step of the way, at the common citizens who were watching with hope and disbelief, at the enormous task of changing a kingdom's heart when half that kingdom didn't want to change. "Yes," she said, "to all of it. The work, the fight, the marriage when we get there. All of it." The applause that followed started with the commons and spread through the younger nobles until even some of the council was clapping, albeit reluctantly. Lord Blackwood stood alone in his section, his expression thunderous. "This is madness. The council will never approve." "Then call another vote," Alaric said. "Call as many as you want. Keep trying to remove me, undermine me, force me back into the comfortable mold of kingship you prefer. But understand this. I'm done compromising with people who mistake cruelty for tradition. The kingdom is changing. You can change with it, or you can be left behind. Your choice." Over the following weeks, the council did call for votes, multiple times. Each one was closer than Alaric would have liked, but each one he won, barely, but enough. And with each vote, the opposition weakened. The pragmatists adapted. The younger nobles embraced the changes. Even some of the traditionalists began to see the benefits of a kingdom where common people believed in the crown's justice. The Office of Common Advocacy grew from Lyra's single room to a full department, staffed by people from all walks of life. They investigated abuses, recommended policies, and slowly, methodically began to shift how the kingdom operated. Not everything changed. Nobility still existed. Hierarchy still mattered. But the sharp edges of that hierarchy were being sanded down, made less cruel, more accountable. And through it all, Lyra and Alaric worked side by side, king and advisor, partners in the truest sense. 6 months after the debate, Alaric made his formal proposal. Not in front of the court this time, but in the small archive room where he'd first told her he loved her. Private, intimate, just them. She said yes immediately. The council approved the marriage by a narrow vote, Lord Blackwood abstaining in silent protest. The announcement sent shockwaves through the kingdom, but by then, Lyra had proven herself too many times for the opposition to gain traction. The wedding was unlike any the kingdom had seen. Half the guests were nobles in their finest silks. The other half were common citizens, servants, soldiers, craftspeople, dressed in their best and seated with equal honor. Marcus attended standing tall despite his crutch. Clara stood as one of Lyra's attendants. Even some of the people from the street she'd known during those terrible 3 weeks found their way there, living proof that she hadn't forgotten where she came from. When Lyra walked down the aisle in a gown that managed to be both simple and stunning, she saw tears on faces throughout the crowd. Not just emotional tears, but something deeper, recognition that the world was changing in ways they'd never dared hope for. Alaric waited at the altar, his crown glinting in the light, but his eyes were only for her. "I, Alaric Draven, King of Thornhaven, take you, Lyra Vance, to be my queen, he said when the moment came. Not because of birth or title, or any tradition that says who belongs where, but because you're brave enough to demand that the world be better. Because you survived everything that should have broken you and came back stronger. Because you make me want to be the king this kingdom deserves. Lyra's turn. I, Lyra Vance, take you, Alaric Draven, to be my husband and my partner. Because you looked at a starving girl in an alley and saw a person worth saving. Because you risked everything for principle when it would have been easier to look away. Because you taught me that power isn't about standing above others. It's about lifting them up. When they kissed, the throne room erupted in applause that shook the walls. And when they turned to face the kingdom as king and queen, Lyra saw something in the crowd that made her throat tighten. Lord Blackwood, standing in the back, had tears on his weathered face. Not of sadness, but something else. Something like surrender to the inevitable, mixed with grudging respect. He caught her eye and gave the smallest nod. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was acknowledgement that she'd won. That she'd proven herself, that the kingdom had changed whether he liked it or not. The feast that followed was legendary. Nobles and commoners mingling, traditions being rewritten with every conversation and toast. It wasn't perfect. Old prejudices didn't die in a single night, but it was a beginning. Late in the evening, Lyra and Alaric slipped away from the celebration. They climbed to the highest tower of the palace and looked out over the city spreading below. "Do you ever think about that alley?" Alaric asked. "Where I found you?" "Every day," Lyra admitted. "It reminds me how far I've come, how easily it could have gone differently." "What would you tell that girl now, the one huddled in the cold thinking she'd lost everything?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then she smiled. "I'd tell her to hold on, that the worst night isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning, that she's stronger than she knows, and that sometimes falling all the way down is the only way to understand what really matters when you climb back up." "That's a hell of a climb," Alaric said. "Yeah." She leaned against him, comfortable in a way she'd never thought possible. "But I had help." "We both did," he said. "Everyone who believed that fairness mattered more than comfort. Everyone who stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Every person who chose to hope instead of accepting that the world has to stay broken." They stood together as the sun set over Thornhaven, painting the snow-covered city in shades of gold and rose. Below them, the kingdom they were rebuilding stretched out in all its complicated, messy, beautiful reality. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. There would always be people like Blackwood who resisted change, always be systems that needed fixing, always be battles to fight. But for the first time in generations, common people believed the crown cared about them, believed that justice might actually be possible regardless of birth or title. Believed that someone who fell all the way down could climb back up and remake the world in the process. And standing there with the man she loved, wearing a crown that represented not just power but purpose, Lyra understood what she'd really survived those streets to do. Not just to prove she mattered, but to prove that everyone did. "Ready?" Alaric asked, offering his hand. "For what?" "Everything else. All the work still ahead. All the fights we haven't fought yet. All the people still waiting for someone to care enough to help them." Lyra took his hand, her fingers threading through his with perfect familiarity. "Ready," she said. And together, a king who'd learned to see beyond his crown and a queen who'd been forged in the streets where compassion died, they descended back into the palace to continue the work of teaching a kingdom that justice wasn't just for those who could afford it. The outcast had become the queen. But more importantly, the kingdom had learned that outcasts deserved crowns too, and that was a truth worth every battle they'd fought to prove it.